Thank you, Dr. Hausch. Thank you, GNC, for hosting this. As Dr. Hausch said, the title of my presentation is Nutritional Supplementation for Strength in Men and Women. And today, I am hoping to cover three very familiar nutrients and or supplements in protein, creatine, and iron. However, I'd like to explore some data that hopefully has you guys thinking about these three in some ways you haven't before, as we basically seek to address the question, do men and women have the same nutritional supplementation needs during resistance training? So to begin, we all know that protein is an essential macronutrient, right? And we know that it's also needed to maximize strength and hypertrophy-related adaptations to resistance training. The current RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kg per day of body weight in healthy adults. However, the RDA may not be sufficient to meet protein needs for those that are regularly engaged in resistance training to maximize muscle size and strength. And kind of the first study I want to look at is actually addressing this issue. So Tarnoposky et al. In 1992 actually sought to determine the protein requirements for sedentary and strength training men by examining nitrogen balance and leucine turnover in response to 13 days of a low protein, a moderate protein, or a high protein diet. In this study, strength training was defined as performing resistance training for greater than 4 days per week. And then total caloric expenditure was matched to each subject's habitual intake. So that means whatever the subject was consuming prior to the study, if they were consuming 2,800 calories, right, they consumed 2,800 calories throughout the duration of the study, and basically protein intake was what was modulated. So the results, average nitrogen balance was negative for the strength training subjects, but was positive for the sedentary subjects on the low protein diet. Okay, so the guys that were consuming 0.86 grams per kg per day and were resistance training were actually in a negative protein balance. We all know that's not good, right? Leucine turnover was greatest in the strength-trained subjects, greater in the strength-trained subjects than in the sedentary subjects, and the authors actually suggested this is probably due to greater whole-body protein synthesis in the resistance training group. And then one of the neat things about this study, they actually used regression analyses to determine the mean protein intake needed to achieve nitrogen balance. And what they found is that in the strength training men, an intake of 1.41 grams per kg per day protein was the mean protein intake needed to actually achieve nitrogen balance for the strength training men. Okay, and then along with this, with these regression analyses, there's kind of a plus or minus 0.35 grams there. And that is actually the 95% confidence interval about that mean. And what that means then is that for 95% of these men, 1.76 grams per kg per day of protein would actually be needed to meet the protein needs for these guys, for 95% of the guys in this study, right? So their recommendation was basically for strength training men, you should be consuming at least 1.76 grams per kg per day. And that's clearly double or over double the RDA, the current RDA. Okay, so we've established that protein needs are increased in individuals who are training to enhance muscle size and strength. But are there any gender differences, right? That's the question that we're going to keep coming back to. Are there any gender differences in protein needs between men and women? So in 1993, Phillips et al. Actually sought to examine the adequacy of the recommended nutritional intake. So this is basically RNI, which is kind of Canada's version of the RDA. In habitually exercising men and women, the participants were matched for training volume and conditioning, and they're all fed isoenergetic diets, okay? So they're at caloric balance. The men and women consumed an adapted diet then containing either 0.94 grams per kg per day, which was the men, or 0.8 grams per kg per day for the women. And then nitrogen balance was measured on the subsequent 3 days, and the subjects actually exercised on day 1 and day 3. And unfortunately, due to kind of the paucity of the research, I actually am drawing from an endurance training study here. And so the exercises performed was actually 90 minutes of submaximal running. And I'll kind of address that a little bit more too, kind of about the paucity of research in men versus women. But in this study, both the men and women were in a negative protein balance. The men actually had a greater total nitrogen loss, and that is illustrated very well here in this figure. Basically, on the left here, and the white bars are the men, the black bars are the women, and this left side here is nitrogen balance at rest, and then on the right is during exercise, and actually this is, leucine oxidation at rest and during exercise, and you can see at both rest and exercise, leucine oxidation was actually greater in the men than in the women. And so this suggests then that perhaps men have a greater protein need because they've got greater leucine oxidation than women do. And so, most of these studies, like the Tarnopolsky study, right, they established 1.76 grams per kg per day might be needed in men that are resistance training. But there's not been any studies that I'm aware of that have actually looked at the same exact issue in women, right? And so this is clearly a just kind of an untapped research area. We clearly need studies that look at very similar things in women, and then also compare men and women. Are the needs actually different? Are the protein needs actually different? It could be suggested from this Phillips article that perhaps there is a slight difference, and that protein needs might be greater in men than in women. All right, so moving on to creatine. Creatine, obviously a very popular nutritional supplement. It's produced endogenously in the liver and the pancreas, but then a very important way to get creatine is actually through the diet and meat and fish products. Once it's consumed, it's transported into the skeletal muscle, the brain, and the heart. And its primary function is as an energy buffer to rephosphorylate ADP. It also may indirectly or directly stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So obviously these two things would be very important for those that are resistance training, right? It might allow you to perform more work, or if you're actually increasing muscle protein synthesis, you're increasing the size of the muscle, and therefore might increase muscle strength to some degree. So I'm actually going to focus on 3 different studies here, or 4 different studies here looking at creatine. Again, there's very few studies that have examined the effects of creatine in men versus women. And so I'm going to look at some studies specifically in women today, because I've had a lot of questions from women about creatine, students who have asked, should I be taking creatine? I'm a woman, should I be taking creatine? And I've seen product formulations out there that are basically creatine-free pre-workouts for women, right? And based on the data, I think women clearly should be taking creatine. So we're going to address some of that today, and I want to cover some of that here. So in 1997, Vandenberghe et al. Actually looked at the effects of creatine on muscle strength, exercise capacity, and body comp, adaptations to resistance training. They had 19 sedentary women that were assigned to either a creatine or a placebo group. They basically completed a 5-day loading phase where they consumed 20 grams per day of creatine, and then completed 10 weeks of resistance training at what Vandenberghe called a low dose, 5 grams per day. During the first 5 days, they saw an increase in skeletal muscle creatine content by 6% in the creatine group. There was no change to the placebo groups. The creatine was getting into the muscle and was doing what it was supposed to do in that way. And then this increase in skeletal muscle creatine content was also maintained throughout the 10 weeks of training. Okay, so the low dose was able to, or 5 grams per day, was able to maintain that creatine content throughout the 10 weeks of training. On to the results. One of the primary outcome variables was 1RM strength for both lower and upper body, and there were 20 to 25% greater increases in muscle strength in the leg press, leg extension, and the squat exercises for the creatine group after 10 weeks of training plus creatine supplementation compared to the placebo. Okay, so if we want to maximize strength in women, it looks like we should be taking creatine based on the results of this study. Another interesting facet of this study was they actually examined the effects of creatine on fatigue. And they did that by examining torque output during 5 sets of 30 maximal isokinetic muscle actions. And basically what you can see here at the top, this is the raw change scores from baseline to after the loading phase, and essentially nothing happened. Okay? But after 5 weeks and 10 weeks of training, the creatine plus resistance training group were able to maintain torque output across all 5 sets to a greater degree than the resistance training plus placebo group. Okay, so not only is creatine important for enhancing muscle strength, but it appears that it's also very important to delay the onset of fatigue, essentially, and allow you to produce more force throughout a fatiguing work bout, right? And obviously that has great implications for resistance training. The more work that you can perform, the greater the volume of training, probably the greater hypertrophy that you observe, and or strength adaptation. And then the last little tidbit of this study was the effects on fat-free mass. And actually in this study, you can see that the creatine group here in the solid dark squares increased fat-free mass to a greater degree than the placebo group, which is the empty squares, right? And so I'd actually have you guys focus here on the training. I guess the first 3 dots are actually the creatine plus training, and then after that, they actually went through a detraining period and they just maintained creatine supplementation. So the first 3 dots are really what I want you guys to look at, and you can see that that rate of increase in fat-free mass is clearly greater for those on creatine than it is for the placebo group. So in summary, with this study, oral creatine supplementation causes greater muscle strength, exercise capacity, and body composition adaptations to resistance training in women. Following this study in 2000, Mihich et al. Actually looked at the effects of creatine loading on total and lean mass in 30 physically active age-matched men and women. And during this study, it was only 5 days long. They basically just wanted to see, okay, what are the effects of creatine on body composition in the first 5 days of creatine loading? Typically, during a loading phase, sometimes there's complaints of increased bloating and things like that, and they wanted to know, okay, is it actually affecting body composition, or what else is going on here? So, in this study, what they observed is that the only increase that they saw was in total body mass for men, not for women, and then there's actually a increase in fat-free mass. There's an interaction there that wasn't significant in follow-up tests, and essentially what they saw was there's a 2% increase in fat-free mass for the men and only a 1% increase in fat mass. Based on these results, Mihich et al. Suggested that the increases in lean body mass following creatine loaded may be greater in men than women. It's probably some weak evidence at best, but clearly longer-term studies were needed then to determine if there are any potential gender differences following creatine supplementation. And Gillibeck et al. In 2004 did exactly that. So they did a longitudinal 6-week creatine supplementation study, and secondary purpose basically of that study was actually to determine if the increase in muscle mass with creatine supplementation is greater in males than in females. What they observed was that bench pressing 1RM increased in both men and women. No differences, no gender differences, right? So it increased to the same degree in both men and women. However, muscle mass increased to a greater degree in the men on creatine than the women, and that effect is pretty clear here in this graph. So in the white here is the creatine males, and the kind of the middle gray bar there is the creatine females. And creatine females were no different than the placebo females and the placebo males. So from these data, it suggests that maybe there's no gender effect for creatine supplementation on muscle strength, but perhaps there is on muscle mass. And then to kind of drive this point home further a little bit, Larson-Meyer in 2000 actually examined the effects of creatine supplementation on muscle strength and body composition during 13 weeks of off-season training in female college athletes, soccer athletes. 14 athletes randomly assigned to either a creatine or a placebo group. They went through 12 weeks of training, and they looked at muscle strength and body composition changes after 5 and then 13 weeks. And essentially what we see is that muscle strength increases to a greater degree in the creatine group, just like the previous studies, right? So this is consistent. That's kind of that top black line, the black dotted line. But then when we look at body mass, there's actually an increase in body mass regardless of whether these girls were in the creatine or the placebo group. There was an increase in lean mass regardless of whether they're in the creatine or the placebo group. And again, so that it suggests that maybe the effects of creatine are not as profound in women as they are in men. Okay? And clearly, I think the evidence here is a little bit weak. There's not much, and more studies need to be done in women for sure, and more studies need to be done comparing men versus women. But for all of you ladies that are worried about creatine supplementation, if you are trying to maximize muscle strength, I think it's pretty clear that you probably should be taking creatine, right? Okay, moving on to the last nutrient. It's iron. And iron, you generally think of iron supplementation for endurance athletes. So why in the heck am I talking about it when I'm talking about maximizing muscle strength and adaptations to resistance training? Well, we all know iron is an oxygen-carrying molecule, iron is a component of oxygen-carrying molecules, such as hemoglobin and myoglobin. It also is in the cytochromes in the electron transport chain, and it's also involved in energy production. The prevalence of iron deficiency with and without anemia is actually 14 to 18% in women aged 18 to 44 in the US. And obviously this prevalence is much greater in athletes, right? Athletes are girls that are undergoing heavy training. And typically, you think of endurance athletes, girls that are running 70 miles a week or more. But there's now evidence to suggest that iron may actually be depleted in non-aerobic athletes. And so I'm going to cover some of that data here. The first study is by Maego Ayuso in 2015. The purpose was to examine the effects of 11 weeks of iron supplementation on hematological and strength markers in elite female volleyball players. Okay, so they're kind of an anaerobic power athlete group. 22 athletes were randomly assigned to either a supplement or a control group. The athletes completed training and/or competed on a daily basis. Serum iron status markers were measured. Muscle strength was measured before and after the 11-week supplementation period. So what happened? Actually, both groups were actually meeting the RDA, the current RDA for iron intake. Interestingly, though, the control group actually experienced a decrease in serum iron, ferritin, transferrin saturation index, and hemoglobin. So despite meeting the RDA for iron, these girls actually became iron depleted throughout the course of their training and competition season. However, there were no changes in the serum markers for the iron group, which is a great thing, right? This suggests that the supplementation actually maintained their iron status, and they did not become iron depleted. And then along with this, there's actually group by time interactions for the power clean, the clean and jerk, and total average strength for a bunch of 1RMs that were measured. These were due to a greater percent increase in power clean, clean and jerk, and total average strength in the iron group compared to the control group. So basically, iron supplementation maintained iron status in these volleyball athletes, and as a result, potentially as a result, they actually increased muscle strength to a greater degree than did the control group. So iron supplementation may reduce the risk of iron deficiency during heavy training and competition periods, even in anaerobic athletes. And this may allow for greater adaptations in muscle strength compared to athletes who do not supplement with iron. And then there's also a study in 2013 by Brutzar et al. Who examined the effects of 6 weeks of iron supplementation on muscle fatigue during dynamic leg extension muscle or exercise. They had 20 iron depleted, so these are already depleted individuals, who were untrained and were women that were then randomly assigned to an iron supplementation group or a placebo group, and the participants completed a dynamic fatigue protocol at 20% MVIC before and after supplementation. Right, so they're looking to see what are the effects of iron supplementation on basically resistance exercise or low load resistance exercise performance. And one of the primary marker that they used was actually the rate of decline in what we call a maximal voluntary contraction. So these girls basically were contracting at 20% MVC, and then every minute throughout the protocol, they had them contract as hard as they possibly could, right? And they used that then as a marker of fatigue. And you can see from here, you can see the rate of decline in the MVC, which is kind of that tall spike, that force output there declining. And so they wanted to see, okay, how does iron supplementation in these iron depleted girls actually affect the rate of decline in MVC? The supplementation actually increased the placebo group actually saw an increase in serum transferrin receptor, but no other changes in serum indicators of iron status. You got to remember these girls were probably consuming iron in their regular diets, so that may be responsible for the serum transferrin receptor increase. But then in the supplementation group, there's actually an increase in serum iron and transferrin saturation, and iron status actually improved then in the iron group. And then looking at the actual rate of fatigue, you can see before control or placebo versus iron supplementation, basically the rate of decline are laid right over top of each other, right? So the decline in MVC is exactly the same. Whereas you can see on the right-hand side, at the very end there, it looks like minutes 5 and 6, particularly minute 6, the decline in MVC is not as great in the iron group as it is in the control group, which suggests that iron supplementation actually improved the ability to maintain force production during a fatiguing resistance training task or low-load resistance training task. Iron supplementation improved overall iron status. Iron supplementation group had an increased resistance to fatigue of the quadriceps femoris muscle during dynamic leg extension exercise. Interestingly, there actually was no significant relationship between iron status indicators and resistance to fatigue, but the authors suggested this was a power issue, essentially a low sample size, and their power was below 0.5 to detect these changes. And so in combination with the previous study, despite meeting RDA for iron intake, iron stores may still be depleted in anaerobic athletes, right? So this suggests a clear need for iron supplementation. Iron status was related to improvements in muscle strength in the first study we looked at. Iron supplementation improved resistance to fatigue in iron-depleted subjects in the second study we looked at. And then this, again, clearly suggests that there's a need for supplementation for those that are training rigorously and regularly, whether they're aerobic or anaerobic, especially in women, right? Here I've got some iron supplementation guidelines. For those that are not iron depleted, 325 milligrams per day of ferrous sulfate is kind of the recommended dosage, which is approximately 100 milligrams per day of elemental iron. And then if you are iron depleted, it's going to take more supplementation or greater supplementation to actually get you back to baseline. And so higher doses are probably required up to 300 milligrams of elemental iron. So that's 3 times more than those that are not iron depleted. And obviously needs in men are probably lower, right? Men don't have a menstrual cycle. They're not losing blood. And so they might have lower needs, but it may be that supplemental iron is warranted during periods of rigorous training. One side note, for both creatine and iron, whether you're a man or a woman, obviously you're going to get less of this if you are a vegetarian, right? And iron uptake actually, even in, let's say, spinach, is going to be lower than if you get it from beef. And so whether you're a man or a woman, both iron supplementation and creatine supplementation would also be strongly recommended based on the fact that you're not going to be getting near as much through the diet. Okay, it's going to be a lot harder for you to meet the RDA. If you are meeting the RDA, you're probably going to have some issues with uptake, especially for iron. And so iron supplementation, creatine supplementation for both men and women who are vegetarian, and then obviously for those that are training very hard. Okay, I'm actually at time, so in summary though, obviously protein, there's some small differences here in maybe needs or for men and women. Protein, perhaps a greater need in men due to greater leucine oxidation. However, at the end of the day, my recommendation to eat high quality sources of protein at every single meal at the least would not change whether you're a man or a woman, right? Creatine, again, for women that are scared to try creatine, it works whether you're a woman or a man. And then iron, obviously there might be a greater iron need for women due to menstruation, but it is possible that both men and women have the need, and future research in all these areas actually needs to be done to compare men versus women. So with that, I think we'll take any questions.
Okay, if you have a question, if you could come to the microphone, that'd be great. I have a chance. Well, they can't hear you the people behind you can't hear you, so the microphone's right there. That'd be great. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, you mentioned that women should take creatine to increase, their strength and muscle mass. Is there an alternative through foods? Because I really don't favor any kind of supplement.
Well, you'd have to be eating a lot of meat and fish. And at the end of the day, basically this creatine supplementation, it's 5 grams per day of creatine. Okay. So to get that through meat or fish is probably not feasible, to be perfectly honest. It's a natural, whether you like creatine supplementation or not, I guess it's a natural substance, right? Mm-hmm. And you produce it in your body. So right. It's not like you're putting anything that's, I guess, not natural to you in your body, but
right.
Anyway.
I just encourage getting it from foods rather than
and I
supplement.
think that you should. I think it starts with diet, right? But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
2 questions, doctor. First, what are the physical symptoms of iron depletion? And second, what are the adverse effects, if any, of excessive creatine consumption?
Well, first, iron depletion. Fatigue would be a big one. I honestly don't know. I don't know beyond fatigue, and I don't know if you're iron depleted versus iron depleted not anemic. Or iron depleted anemic, the differences there are probably going to be pretty drastic. I'm not sure if the symptoms of iron depletion would be so crazy that you'd even notice them. I can't answer that. I don't know. What was the second question?
What are the adverse effects, if any, of excessive creatine consumption?
Excessive creatine consumption, defined as?
Well, in your study, you cited the loading phase was 20 grams per day. Say I'm speculating 50 grams per day.
I would say, with 20 grams per day, there's no adverse effects reported, right? So I don't know why anybody would consume 50 grams per day. And I don't know of anybody that has, so I guess I can't speak to that. But at 20 grams per day for a loading phase, there's no adverse effects reported. So hopefully that answers your question to some degree.
Okay, thank you, doctor.
Yeah.
So you spoke about ultra endurance exercises with the creatine and the iron, and is all these over endurance exercises? And I know you talked about some of the non-aerobic, but mainly for the protein, you said it was mainly on endurance. Could that have an effect?
Well, for that one study, basically suggesting potentially an increased protein or leucine oxidation in men versus women, that was actually an endurance exercise model, right? So there are no studies examining that in a resistance training model. So clearly studies are needed. What exactly was
especially towards females. So resistance training with creatine towards females. It seems like it's an unstudied area, especially with the resistance portion. And I feel like
For resistance training.
Right. Is
Yeah.
that like the next step that we should be focusing on right now?
Well, I think
Like-
there's clearly, like I said, I think there's
Right.
clearly an untapped
Yeah.
research area there, men versus women, or the effects of nutritional supplementation on women. The vast majority of the data is in men.
Yeah.
It is.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doctor.
Yep.
Thank you for that talk. In any of these studies that looked at iron supplementation, it didn't seem like they controlled for menstrual cycle, and is there some baseline evidence that iron status changes during the menstrual cycle? And if so, how are any of these studies controlling for that?
I mean, so theoretically, each woman then would serve as zero control, theoretically, if they are being tested at the same point, from here and here, and they're on a regular cycle, then they should be at the same point in their cycle anyway. And so any changes in iron status would be reflective of the iron supplementation and not the actual menstrual cycle. Now, if you were to test them week 1 and then week 5 or something like that, then possibly. And I didn't speak to controlling for menstrual cycle, and I honestly can't tell you exactly how they did that in the study the studies that I looked at. Probably should know that, but yeah.
And since they were 5 and 6 week studies, we can assume that they weren't in the same phase. So do you know if there's that baseline information about whether it changes?
I don't know.
Okay,
Honestly.
thank you.
Yep.
I would also say with the creatine, the question about creatine, too much creatine. There are different, of course, delivery systems for creatine. The studies I think Nate was talking about where it was creatine monohydrate, and 20 grams is the classic loading phase. There are other delivery systems like polyethylene glycosylated creatine, which utilizes lower doses but gives you the same muscle phosphocreatine levels. Some of Andy Fry's work in that area. So there are different delivery systems that require different amounts of creatine. And if you're concerned about how much creatine you're taking, you might look into the delivery system because you can use lower doses and still get the same results. Any other questions before we go on? Thank you very much. We'll take about a 5-minute break and we'll have our second presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's fantastic to be here. I cannot believe the turnout for this session. Thank you very much. It means a lot to have everyone sort of packing in here. I was joking earlier that you're here for a strength and conditioning conference, but this is certainly the endurance part of it, and you've done a good job. So thanks for making it this far. I'm happy to be here to get into some of our research on nighttime feeding that we've been doing, I guess, about the past 6 years or so. It's a fascinating area for me, and really any of the research that our group conducts, we end up with a common question like, who cares? And I think that's something that's appropriate because it helps with bridging the gap, sort of the whole theme of this conference. And that's what I hope to get to today. We'll talk about the context of nighttime feeding, what to eat, the amount of calories, macronutrient profiles, what it does for various sorts of people, from overweight and obese all the way to pretty good athletes, and we're still trying to get that elite group. But we've got some solid athletes that we started to do some work in this area. So who cares is the outcome from this. If you trust the Google machine, you get results like this, and apparently people care, and there's a trend line going up, but there's obviously no y-axis. So somebody cares, I just don't know how many that is. And it looks like if you break it out by country, you can see clearly the US, North America dominating this. Google searches for things on nighttime feeding as well as Australia. So if you believe that, and then you go to your handy Google sources for media clips, again, seems like people care, and it seems like every week I get inundated with something that has to do with nighttime feeding. Can I eat? Should I not eat? Does it make me fat? Does it make me skinny? What's the deal? And so with that context, we started to look into this a little bit. But the very first context I had was this. This is me eating at nighttime. And that's what most people think, right? It's your ice cream and your glass of wine. And inevitably, I'll get the question every time, if you guys invented a Florida State version of nighttime ice cream to rival the Gators in their Gatorade product. All right, so if I get into the background of this, there are some concerns for nighttime eating, and I think it's legit to think about this in the calorie context. Primarily, we do have the ability to store excess fat at various depots, particularly later in the day. We have a different way that we metabolize and store things. Sleep quality is often a concern. I think you all might know from experience if you've had certain types of foods, they just don't agree, potentially heartburn or other things that could be a problem. And just various circadian things should be considered. Overall, things like our decrease in metabolism as the day goes on, decrease in glucose tolerance, potential gastric emptying changes, which is also unique to if you provide whey or casein. It seems to be a different slow release profile in the evening. And then how does it work for appetite and satiation? And those are things that I think most people are concerned about. But when I started to look at this data, what was really cool for me was that, one, there wasn't a ton of it in the context that I wanted to view it in. But if you look at it in the context of whole foods, so mixed macro meals, and large mixed macro meals, that's where all the data existed before 2010. So everybody was feeding majorly high-calorie foods and in the evening, and particularly they looked at nighttime eating syndrome or people who had shift work scenarios. And in both of those cases, the outcomes were always poor, and that's why we had some of the media folks start to say, stop eating at certain times. Cutoff points should exist for a calorie control. What I like about this figure is it shows us what happens to the same exact meal if you eat it at 3 different times in the day. So they gave it at 9 a.m., 5 p.m., or 1 a.m. And it's the same meal, 544 calories. You see the macro profile on the left, 15% protein. And this was in 9 non-obese young men. And from the figure, you can see there are 3 distinct lines. And I want to point out and highlight that bottom line. That's the response to the same meal in terms of energy expenditure from that meal in the evening, the 1 a.m. meal. And so it looks like it goes in order. So the highest line is what happens in the morning, then the afternoon, and the night. So you do work with the nutrients a little bit differently. And again, this is why people were scared off. Now, if you combine this with data that came about 10 years later, you saw some very similar things, which would again lead to the conclusion that, hey, stay away from nighttime food because it could be a weight concern. Again, this has nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with getting to optimal levels of anything. It's just a weight concern. But what you see here, again, on the left, you see time of day differences on a mean meal size. And all this is showing is that, I highlighted the areas for you, between in the evening hours, say after dinner, you're looking at 1,800 to 2,200, you have 2 things going on. On the left, you see the size of the meal is the greatest. And on the right figure, you see your satiation from that meal is the lowest. And so that combination, again, could set you up to overeat in the late evening hours. It just seems to make sense from this original data. And if that's the case, and weight gain's the problem, then something needs to be considered. We need to stop using nighttime eating syndrome folks or stop using people who have shift work and start looking at everybody else. And that's sort of the title of this talk. What happens to everybody else? All right. So if we still consider this pre-sleep eating context as potentially bad, you can get these check marks. Large portions of food, we just saw that. Potentially impaired sleep. You see some various psychology going on as well. It's linked to feelings of depression. It's linked to some other sort of cognitive impairments that are outside the scope of what we do, but they were still important to mention, as well as hormone irregularities. So if you're having these large meals late at night, what happens to some of the things we think about with insulin and cortisol and perhaps some of the other hormones we know to fluctuate on circadian rhythms? All right, now if I have impaired response to food intake, clearly, again, we're seeing this could be a problematic time to consider eating food. There are a few things to point out, though, which really draw attention to methodological issues outside of the population used in these studies. So the eating pattern that a lot of this early research has and the proportion of food and the size of the food needs to be considered. For example, if you're eating frequently, if you're eating just 1 meal a day, if you're doing it's pretty much the same thing with this intermittent fasting, the backloading, the nighttime feeding. You need to consider exactly what time of day you're looking at. And are you talking about eating before you go to bed? Or are you talking about waking up in the middle of the night to get up and then have a large meal or a shake or something? You know, in the context of athletes, what's interesting for me is everyone was saying for a long time, don't eat at night before you go to bed. But the leanest people I knew were bodybuilders who always ate before going to bed. Typically, like a cottage cheese meal was some of the things, the tenets that I grew up on trying to emulate from some of these guys I read about in the magazines. Like, yeah, eat this before bed, have a shake ready. If you have to wake up to use the bathroom, like down the shake and then get back in bed. So it didn't really make sense for us. And I think what we started to look at specifically was what happens after dinner but before bed. That's where we were sort of defining what we thought nighttime feeding was in the context of all the work that we do, as well as the work that I work and collaborate a little bit with Luc Van Loon, who's another guy doing nighttime feeding research. And exercise and activity was never brought into the conversation. We had no idea what that did to the context of nighttime feeding. All right, so that's sort of the background for where we began this line of research. Like, it seems like it's bad, there's not a lot of research, but I know a lot of people who look great, feel great, and eat at night, so what's the deal? So we focus on metabolism, body composition, performance. We look at overall health measures. And we started this research a while back, and along the way, we started to think again with the question, who cares? Who cares about this stuff? Well, if you're an athlete, there are some times when you really need to consider that nighttime feeding could be the very best thing for you. For example, luckily enough, 2 years ago, we were able to follow and do a research study on the Ultraman Florida event. I live in Florida, and so it wasn't too far away. However, this is a 3-day triathlon, and it's over 321 miles. It's insane. And the first day is a 6.2-mile swim and then a 92-mile bike ride. That obviously goes till late in the night. You go to sleep, wake up, and then you start again the very next morning and have a 171-mile bike ride. It goes till late in the night. You go to bed, and then the next morning you have a double marathon to run. It's a long weekend. So I spent the weekend in a van following these people around, jumping out and taking blood. And I'll tell you what, the weight fluctuations, the way that these athletes were aiming at purposefully consuming foods before they went to bed at night, sure as heck that's going to impact your next day performance. In this context, it's extreme, right? It kind of makes sense. Yeah, of course you need to eat. What would you do, go to bed and not eat anything and then get up and do it again? Doesn't make any sense. So I think what I'm trying to do is merge these concepts from like, maybe you shouldn't do it in some cases with these big meals, to logically, yes, it makes clear sense that we should be thinking about what to eat before bed. Now, when we looked at other data, there was really only one study that existed at the time, which was from 2004, and it was an interesting study. It started to look at post-dinner, but pre-sleep food, and it wasn't a great calorie amount. This was a cereal study, sponsored by Kellogg's, of course, and they had a cereal intake 90 minutes after dinner, okay? And what they ended up looking at was a calorie content of about 135 calories. You can see the macro breakdown that's listed there. The blue bar on the left is the group that had cereal, and this is over the course of this short study, 4 weeks. And the red bar on the right is the group that got no cereal after dinner. And what you can tell from this is over the context of time, this is from a 3-day food log, so again, you have to take that with a grain of salt. But it did end up showing that there was a reduction in overall calorie intake, as opposed to an increase in overall calorie intake from telling these people to have cereal before they went to sleep. It did pan out to some potential meaningful differences. The data was in a table, so I flipped it and made it into a figure for you, and then it doesn't look very impressive. But nevertheless, there were some differences to look at. This is body weight change from baseline. Again, the blue bar on the left is our cereal group, and the bar on the right, the red bar, is the no cereal group. So the group that had cereal had less calorie intake, and then also had a reduction in body weight. All right. Maybe good, maybe bad. Now, the psychology on this is interesting. I was speaking with a colleague about this, and again, they were saying, well, perhaps just by knowing you can eat again, you don't eat as much at the other meals. So you don't just gorge yourself at dinner. You say, oh, I get to eat again in 90 minutes. It's kind of like a dessert coming. So maybe I won't stuff myself now, and then it ends up evening the calories out or lessening the calories out over time. Interesting data also exists from a short 7-day study where people were fed a protein-dominant diet, a carbohydrate-dominant diet, or a fat-dominant diet. Then they looked at, after 7 days, they looked at the sleeping metabolic rate. And the group that had the highest protein intake, which in this study was about 32% protein in their total diet, that group is shown in the blue bar. And what it's demonstrating is that while you're sleeping, your metabolic rate is going to drop. But the group that had the highest protein in their habitual diet tended to salvage that a little bit. It stayed just a little bit higher. All right, so we started thinking, what if we fed purposefully just an acute study before you went to bed, and then we looked at metabolic rate the following morning. So skipping the whole evening point. At that time, we weren't having sleepover studies yet, and we ended up measuring a lot of metabolism studies. And so that was really the first study. We looked at, of course, college-age men. We can get our population from that fairly easily. And in this nighttime group, we had them come on 4 occasions. It was an acute study, so it was kind of fun. They came in, they arrived to the lab, they would get a placebo, a carbohydrate drink, a whey drink only, or a casein drink. And they're all isocaloric and isonitrogenous except for the placebo group. They did drink something, but it was blinded, but it was hard to not tell there wasn't like some kind of protein in it. It was just a drink. Nevertheless, what we saw was that the only group that didn't have this maintenance of metabolism the following morning was the group that didn't have anything, the placebo group. Every other group had an increase in estimated caloric expenditure. So in this sense, in these relatively fit men, having something to eat before bed, no matter if it was carbohydrates, 100% carbohydrates, 100% whey, or 100% casein, their metabolic rate stayed elevated through the evening. Okay, nice. Nothing groundbreaking, but nice. When we looked at the RQ values from this, just as an estimation for what happens with fat oxidation, carb oxidation, we started to see some interesting patterns emerge. Again, this is in college-aged men. You can see the placebo group on the left has the asterisk, and that means that it is significantly different and lower than the carbohydrate group and the whey protein group. But it is not different than the casein protein group. All right, so you're talking about a tiny little difference. I always hate when people exaggerate on these data. The data is the data, that's what it looks like, but certainly something's going on. It looks like the placebo and the casein, in terms of fat oxidation, were not different from each other. And some data I heard yesterday was going into some very similar topics on this, where having a protein drink didn't blunt fat oxidation, particularly a casein protein drink in this case. All right, so that's our RQ values. Now, we took this next step and looked at overweight and obese women. Very similar design. We had a placebo, a whey group, and a casein group. And with this particular one, you can see there's your appetite scale. So desire to eat, there's a time effect. If you had something before you went to bed, you had a less desire to eat the next morning. And the same thing with satiation on the right. You had an increase in satiation the next morning. So the question becomes, is that good or bad? You got an overweight and obese person, the next morning, they're not as hungry. Is that good? Do you offset calories? Or is it a scenario where you're skipping breakfast now? Is that a problem? May or may not be the case, but it gives us more questions. And so we went and attacked this over the last couple of years in terms of, is this a good or a bad thing? Now, the metabolic outcomes from this acute study are shown here. On the top, what I want you to know is that there's no statistically different anything here. But as a researcher who often finds no significant differences, you have to look at it kind of closely. And when I'm looking at this, I see a pattern emerge. It is not statistically different. But what's the pattern? I can see that the whey protein and the casein protein tend to stay a little bit higher in their RMR response than the placebo group, in this case, which was carbohydrate. So perhaps there's an advantage to having that from it. But we can't forget the disadvantages. In an acute study, when we give them these various drinks before going to sleep at night, in obese women, they had an increase in their insulin response. They had an increase in some of the problems you might expect from eating foods at that time. So maybe this lends credit to we shouldn't consider this in that population. Overweight and obese women was the case. But we were not exercising them. They were sedentary. They did not work out. And so we thought, well, let's look at that. What if we actually included an exercise training program and to see if that effect gets blunted? And that's exactly what we saw. When we carried this out over 4 weeks instead of just one night, there were no significant differences in the insulin values pre or post that 4-week study. And we were able to show that, again, and this is why this beauty of all these exercise conferences are fantastic, exercise works. The exercise was working. And we have data that's showing great benefits, but the drink wasn't necessarily doing all that much more. But I want to point out that the problems with insulin went away when they exercised 3 times a week for 4 weeks. All right, now satiation, you saw very similar responses here. In this case, over 4 weeks of time, every single night they had this drink before going to bed. Again, they were working out 3 days a week. And in this case, satiation increased. They felt less hungry. And the group that had the best response was the casein group. So again, you're sort of teasing these little things out of casein. Maybe it doesn't blunt lipolysis as much. You also see that it perhaps increases satiation a little bit more. When you look at change in fat mass, again, no statistically different findings here, but you do see a pattern emerge. Again, with the placebo, which in this case was carbohydrate, you had an increase in your fat mass, and then in our 2 protein groups, you saw a reduction in fat mass. So you're seeing something going on that looks to be beneficial, and we always, like every study, more time, more subjects, more needs to be done. But it is interesting just to note the pattern. Now, this is the data. I've shown you both of these already. I just put them side by side. The left one is our acute study, and the right one was the one with exercise. You see some similar things come from it. They're a little more exaggerated when exercise is included to show some positive things. So these are change in metabolic rate, where you see, again, no statistically different findings, but I just wanted to show the pattern is the same and gets exacerbated a little bit with the exercise included. Again, that's 3 days per week. So we wrapped up a lot of this early metabolic data and put together a nice review led by Dr. Kinsey, one of my former doctoral students. And she put this together. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, this review kind of covers everything I just went through, but a ton of more detail. But where this left us was like, what's the mechanism? What's going on? We're missing the whole nighttime window. We fed them, and then we didn't see them until the morning. So we wanted to get an idea of a little more specifically what was happening overnight. So that led us to begin using the technique of microdialysis. And with microdialysis, you can insert a small probe into the subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue, and you can measure glycerol as an indicator of lipolysis. And so you can actually put these in any depot. We're right now just doing it in the subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue. But you can put them in muscle, you can put them in gluteal. We've done that before at some different places, at different research sites. But right now at Florida State, we're just doing in the abdominal fat. But anyway, you put the probes into the actual adipose tissue, and the probe lands in the interstitial space. And then what's liberated from the cell is free fatty acids and glycerol. And then because free fatty acids have the risk of reesterification, of course, glycerol tends to be a more stable marker for lipolysis. So that's really where we focused our attention here. And so we began to put these probes in and then have them in all night so that we could see the lipolytic response that was occurring from consumption of these various drinks. We started this study with way more arms than just casein and placebo, but it turns out people don't love getting poked in the belly and then sleeping with this stuff in. So we were able to get data on 2 of the arms of this study, the casein group and a placebo. That's what we were able to study in this one. This was in obese men, and we fed them a normalized diet the whole day before to try to rule out any complications from that. We gave them a drink to take. Again, all of our studies, they're taking their drink within 30 minutes of getting into bed. Now, does that mean going to sleep? I don't know. So we finally put watches on these people to see if their sleep latency. When did they fall asleep? How long did it take? And did it affect sleep quality? So Luke's lab has been at this about the same amount of time. Luckily, at this point, we've stopped trying to rush papers out, and we started looking at things together, which is fun, to interpret these the best way that we possibly can. This is 2 different studies are represented here. This is an indication of muscle protein synthesis. It's the fractional synthetic rate. They use a fantastic technique with stable isotope tracers that they actually inject into a Holstein cow, and then they milk that cow, and the milk has the radio-labeled proteins in it. It's really a cool technique. They've done this in a number of studies now, but these are the 2 original ones. The younger men had the increase in this fractional synthetic rate muscle protein synthesis overnight. They stayed in their unit all night in this study, in both of these studies. And then the same response was seen in older men. Average age was like 74 years old. This, we have to point out, that was nasogastric tubing into the gut. They didn't actually drink it, but in the young men, they did drink that particular shake. So again, they're using these same types of drinks, same types of calorie loads, and you're seeing an increase in muscle protein synthesis. Might be nice, because if you look at the previous data showing there's no blunting of lipolysis and you have this fractional synthetic rate increase, is that the best of both worlds? And it's not a lot. It's like 130 calories, 140 calories in all of these studies. Okay, so that's great, but anyone who's been in this field for a while, you understand muscle protein synthesis rate does not mean lean mass accrual. It just means your synthesis rate is up. And what happens to degradation? And so there's some other questions that had to be answered. And we have not talked about performance at all. And that's the cool part. It's like, what happens to performance? What can we do with this? Well, Luke's group attacked this about 2 years ago. They took on a study to start looking at long-term, and it was 12-week, adaptation to having a drink every night before going to bed. And this is their data from that study that came out last year. On the top, you see muscle size. On the bottom, you see muscle strength. Both of them significantly increased with the nighttime intake of a protein drink before going to bed. All right, so that's pretty nice. But some things to point out as well. This is the first one where the pre-sleep drink included 15 grams of carbohydrate. That hadn't happened before this one. So it's not only protein, it's also carbohydrate in that drink. And then when you look at the difference in the protein intake between the groups over this study, 1.3 versus 1.9 grams per kg. So yeah, they're different, but that's, if you look at some of the data from Boss's lab, they have this protein spread and protein change theories, and you have to have such a greater increase from your baseline and such a spread between the groups in order to see differences. They didn't meet the spread, but they still saw significant differences. So that was pretty powerful when I was reviewing that. I thought it was a good addition to this. This paper was highly criticized for not matching protein, though. So the group that went to sleep and took the protein had more protein than the group that didn't get the protein shake. So a lot of people were saying, well, you should have given a protein shake in the middle of the day in one group and then right before sleep in the other one. So is the magic taking it before sleep, or is it that you just had more protein in your whole day? And that question has not been answered yet, but I know there are a number of groups now that are starting to do this work and look at matching now for protein, including ours. Now, just recently, Luke's lab again put out some more data, and this was a paper recently came out, Journal of Nutrition. What they did in this was also older men. It was like 74-year-old men, and what they saw was an increase in fractional synthetic rate, just like they had shown before. But if you lifted before taking the drink and then going to bed, so they had like an evening workout at like 9 p.m., then that particular group had a greater muscle synthetic rate overnight while they were sleeping. It kind of makes sense, just like all the data you've seen on post-workout nutrition. Oftentimes you can have this MPS response. Again, this particular one was acute, though, was not that 12-week design. So it looks like, in an acute sense, you have this increase in muscle protein synthesis with pre-sleep protein, in particular casein. In a longer-term setting that we just looked at over 12 weeks, number one, it's well tolerated, and number two, it looks like an effective strategy to, one, perhaps just get more protein in the diet, but also to increase muscle and to increase strength. And again, that's obviously a highly useful bit of data to have. But might it be simply a way to increase your total daily protein intake? And the answer is, yeah, that could be it. But the design of that was just, if you're not worrying about that and you just think about right before bed, should you take it or should you not? It looks like, yeah, you should in these cases. So we were interested in looking at this in some performance parameters. And so the effect of nighttime feeding here was on hydration status and performance in endurance athletes. And actually, I was just made aware that the Colleen in the middle was just qualified for Rio, which is pretty cool. These athletes were very good runners. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the A team, but we got some of the B team from the squad that would come run with us, that the coaches would let us use. And what we did was we used a chocolate milk product. So for us, that was a way to start using potential real foods. To this point, it had been all shakes and powders and stuff. And not that chocolate milk, the way we got it, wasn't that way, but it came in a ready-to-drink thing, and it was chocolate milk. And we collaborated with the athletics on this one, which was really nice. We just published this paper. It came out in APNM about 2 weeks ago. The design was pretty neat. What we did for this one was the night before they had either chocolate milk or a placebo, similar to the other studies that we did. They had this overnight fast period. Then they arrived to the laboratory. And then we did this scaled incremental fat max testing, and to see how the metabolic responses occurred for carbohydrate and fat oxidation at a submax level. So this is this tiered thing. So they began at a 55%, and they went to 65, and they went to 75%, just so we could get a snapshot of the metabolic change at those various intensities. Then they stopped that, used the bathroom one more time, and then they just got on there and just hauled for a 10K time trial where they could not see their speed or anything. They could only see the time or the distance that they've covered. And they just try to go and go and go. And with that, we thought, all right, fairly good design, the best we could do at the time to figure out any performance changes as well as metabolic adaptations. So what we found was that there were changes in the way that we handle carbohydrates and fat in those incremental stages. So you can see the 55, 65, and 75% of VO2 peak. Those are the three bullets. They're offset just so you can see it a little bit better. But in each case, the chocolate milk group did something. If you had it at night, you had higher carbohydrate oxidation in those three levels, and you had lower fat oxidation, which you would expect. So this was cool for us. Up until this point, we weren't really sure how much metabolism might be affected from a pre-food meal more than about 4 hours. And now we're showing about 7 to 9 hours. You're still influencing the macronutrient selection. Okay, but what else did we see? Chocolate milk consumption at night does affect a few things. Caloric expenditure went up a little bit. Well, we saw that with all the other studies too, in obese and lean men and everybody. Increase in carbohydrate oxidation. We did see an increase in blood glucose compared to the placebo. That's one of those ones that's statistically significant, but it's like 1 point. So it's probably not a massive deal. And then you looked at time trial. So the time trial came out absolutely identical, no difference. So despite the changes that we saw in carbohydrate oxidation, which might think you would use, have a faster 10K time trial perhaps, didn't turn out. There was no difference in time trial from having the chocolate milk before bed. So now we're wondering, well, did we give them enough? Maybe it wasn't enough volume. Maybe it wasn't enough content. Maybe there was too much time. But practically, a lot of 10K runners might not eat before a 10K. I know many elite 10K runners who don't eat because of the risk of gastric upset. So if we can affect something way before, like night before they go to sleep, and not have to wake up at 4 in the morning to get ready for a race that's of a shorter duration where they won't eat or drink anything, then maybe we can begin to sort of pan out more as we look at dose effect. We've begun a study looking at this response in other athletes. This is in collaboration with Dr. McCune in South Africa. This particular group is training out of the Prime Human Performance Lab there. And we started to use pretty elite rugby players, but it turns out compliance was terrible. Did not like to show up for much. So we ended up shifting to some of the other athletes that were training there, but were in season. So we're still collecting that data now. But it still gets us to a point where we should start to consider how do these things merge together, right? In an ideal scenario, you've got this casein group that's increasing muscle protein synthesis from all Luke's work, and then we're showing perhaps metabolic changes that are going on and satiation differences, and if you can merge those, it's a good idea. Now, this might seem like I'm going to come out of left field with this next topic, but I'll get there. It is related. What about train high, sleep low? You guys familiar with that? There's a train high, sleep low sort of phenomenon that's going on now. A lot of people are putting out in the media, as well as researchers are coming out with data about train high, sleep low. Now, that's not altitude training. What we're talking about here is completely different, and it's carbohydrate availability. So train high, so for your high intensity efforts, you have enough carbohydrate availability to fuel that session, and then you sleep low carbohydrate availability. So you just wouldn't restock glycogen. And the attempt is to create a metabolic situation where you are better at using fat as a fuel, and then you are fueling properly. So for a high-intensity exercise bout, you'd have enough carbohydrate. And then for a low-intensity bout, and these would be not often, like a few times a week, they were doing these low-intensity, low-carbohydrate sessions to try to optimize the ability to use fat and get the enzymes sort of ramped up that might do that. So that's why people are kind of frantic right now about, can we use fat as a fuel? We know the storage depots are much, much greater. They can push you to a limit that is far longer as well. And the tank is just huge. So if you can get at that fuel source, then perhaps it's a good thing. So there are 2 or 3 recent studies out on this. Most of them are coming from the Australian Institute of Sport, John Hawley and Louise Burke's lab. And I want to point out here a couple of things. That's sleeping person is what I'm interested in. What are they doing before they go to sleep? And how does it affect performance? And then this is a meal. That just means they ate something. And then in the design, it looks like the other group just didn't get anything. Okay? And then when you look at the data, you get all these blips and things that are molecular signaling pathways that increase the ability to use fat as a fuel. And that's great. But I was talking with Louise Burke about this, and she said, well, that doesn't win gold medals. What does is performance. So how does that ultimately change? So even though you're upregulating these markers of lipid metabolism, and there's a little bit of evidence for changes in mitochondrial biogenesis, which would be good, does it matter? Does that actually translate to anything? This study didn't actually look at any performance markers, but this one did. And this is the one I want you to really remember, because it's all over the media at the moment. In this particular one, they saw 3% increases in performance by not eating before going to sleep. Okay, so it kind of goes in the face of everything I've just been telling you. Or does it? That's the key. When you look at the data, it is fascinating. Sleep low, 3% improvement. That's 73 seconds in a 10K time trial. That's a lot. That is a lot for these elite triathletes. And they did a scenario here where they rode the bike for 40 minutes and then they did a 10K as fast as they could and had this outcome occur. But what I want to point out is their eating schedule. I found this from their original publication before it hit the nice formatting that's in the current journal format. So I highlighted things that say dinner. But what nobody talks about is that arrow that's right down there, which says protein drink before sleep. Boom. Yes. Nobody talks about that. In these cases, in order to not have any problem with muscle being degraded overnight, in order to avoid that sort of degradation profile, they give protein drinks. And the protein drinks provide calories. So they're not actually fasted. People think they didn't eat anything. They did. They had a protein shake before going to bed at night. And it merges nicely, or at least it starts to tell a story that in these elite athletes, which are triathletes, they're getting something before bed. It just, they're manipulating when the carbohydrates are included and when they're not. So perhaps that protein drink is a good thing to consider. And it makes me want to do a new study, which is called Train High, Sleep Low, and Sleep High. Manage overall energy intake and mouth rinse or caffeinate to improve performance. That's a mouthful, but perhaps we can pull it off. And I think we can summarize it in a couple of sections. An endurance section, a strength section, and then some take-home points for you all. Endurance-wise, there's not a lot of data. We've put up what we can so far. We saw no change in performance with that chocolate milk intake. We saw no change in hydration status. We did see an increase in carbohydrate oxidation, be that what it will. We did see an increase in metabolic rate. It looks like the train high, sleep low, and then parentheses with sleep low carbohydrate. It seems promising so far. And our strength and power athletes seem to do very well with it in terms of increased muscle protein synthesis from Luke's work, improved lean mass and strength, which has been documented now over 12-week studies. And in our preliminary snapshot on that initial rugby study, which no one would comply with, we start to see some various things with recovery. So they tend to feel a little subjectively better in their next workout. So that'll pan out over the hopefully next 6 months when we get that data finalized. And also important to note is there's no GI distress. A lot of times people ask, well, did they have trouble sleeping? Did they have any of this? Did it cause any GI distress? We didn't see any of it. Of note, I guess, is that I did mention the sleep quality. We've only used those watches on a subset of 6 people from the obese male study. And it turns out they all were very poor sleepers anyway. They all had like 4.5 hours of sleep normally. So we didn't mess that up at all. It was the same amount, but they still didn't sleep at all anyway. So probably contributing to all the other things that were going wrong. So here's some bullets for you for your take-home messages. Large mixed meals will increase your chance for weight gain when taken late at night. There's a lot of data to support that. But these small protein-rich drinks appear to increase metabolism and satiation. So we're looking at a protein-dominant source is really all we've looked at, but it does seem to improve it. Pre-sleep protein may not blunt overnight lipolysis. It's kind of like this double negative, but it's just not blunting it like you might expect with a carbohydrate drink. And so perhaps you can maximize or optimize the MPS with the normal level of lipolysis and oxidation. In obese women, these small night snacks appear to increase insulin resistance unless exercise is included. Again, win for exercise. Incorporate train high, sleep low strategies for low intensity training. Seems to work fairly well, but again, put the asterisk there with a protein shake. Maintain normal carbohydrate availability for high intensity training. All right, that's important note from all that data I was just showing you guys. Eating before sleep appears to be a successful strategy for improving lean mass and strength when lifting weights. I think that's probably the biggest thing for this group is like that's what we're seeing with the data. And the bottom line is this: enhanced quality of training and metabolic adaptations for superior performance outcomes with protein before sleep and periodized eating. There's a lot more to this story, and I can't wait to unravel some more of it as our line continues here. We've got many, many upcoming studies to balancing the protein intake, which has been a problem, and not a problem, but sort of left out of the design in the previous studies. And then we're starting to look at whole foods as well, which I think is a benefit. Be remiss not to thank my research team, the doctoral students, particularly Amber Kinsey did a ton of this work before she graduated and continued on, as well as a host of collaborators. Also, NSCA, it was fantastic for funding some of this for doctoral work for some of these student researchers. Diametize Nutrition funded a lot of the, or provided a lot of the product and funding for the protein portions of those. And then we had some support from Seminole Athletics as well with this. So thank you very much, appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much. I want to thank the NSCA for inviting me here to speak today on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is alcohol. And I want to remind you that at the end, we're going to have free samples. You just have to go down to the exhibit hall, 5 o'clock. So there'll be a chance to try this out on your own, okay? So today we're going to talk about alcohol and exercise and really see how do these fit together. The good news, probably for some of you, is that I do bring some good news along. Alcohol doesn't seem to be quite as bad as of a rep that it has sort of gotten, at least from some of these aspects. So what we're going to talk about first, I'll talk about alcohol use and physical activity, athletes and so forth, what the use of epidemiological data. Then we'll talk about alcohol's effect on performance, whether you drink during, before, or after exercise. Okay? And then at the end, we'll talk about some of the physiological effects that alcohol has, both acute and chronic, and how that might sort of play into what we see with performance. So if we first look at alcohol use and physical activity, those of you who are in athletics are probably not surprised that, yeah, people that are physically active do actually drink alcohol. A lot of people that are outside our area really think, well, people that are exercise, they're healthy, they're not going to drink. Okay, but the data doesn't really support that, and I'll show you that to you. So if we look, this is in male and female college students or traditional college students. You can see here, if you look at people that exercise infrequently, so fairly sedentary compared to people that are frequent exercisers, that you have higher alcohol consumption in the people that are more physically active. If you look at the amount consumed, it's also greater. Now, if you look at cigarettes, it's the opposite, which you might suggest. So at least it looks like this is correct. Okay? So what you really see is people that are more active are drinking more. Okay? Also, there's a positive relationship between physical activity and binge drinking, in that people that are more physically active, as in meeting the physical activity guidelines for Americans, also have higher incidence of binge drinking. If we look at so basically frequency and amount of use goes up with more physical activity. Now, it doesn't mean there's a cause and effect relationship here, but there certainly is a correlation. If we look at a large sample from the BRFSS, we'll see here, you can see about 140 women and 110,000 men. So large sample, cross-sectional samples, we see the same pattern, except across the top here, we have alcohol use from either not drinking at all to heavy users, and then the minutes of physical activity per week. And when you look across here, you can see both for the men and women, whether it's total or vigorous activity, that as you move into drinking more, those are also the individuals that exercise more. So physical activity and alcohol use is positively and fairly strongly correlated. Okay? Now, if we look at athletes, again, probably not surprising to those who work with athletes that athletes actually drink, but outside of our realm, people are surprised by this. So the NSCA has surveys about every 2-3 years on alcohol use, drug abuse, all this. Clearly, alcohol is the most used drug among college athletes. And what's interesting is that the use is high, and it's at or above what you actually see in their college peers. So college athletes drink as much or more than their non-athletic peers. They also heavily engage in binge drinking, which is one of the things, even though sort of overall consumption has gone down a little bit and sort of plateaued, binge drinking is one of the things that are really coming up. And that's not just in athletes, that's across the population, that binge drinking is really sort of one of the new problems that we're sort of starting to see emerge. And again, we see a lot of these people start drinking before they come to college. So overall, when you look at physical activity and alcohol, you see that people that are athletes or highly physically active, they drink more than those who are sedentary. They are more engaged in binge drinking. They consume more alcohol. So overall, there's something going on with physical activity and exercise. It's tricky to figure out what is actually going on here, but there are some things about exercise and alcohol hitting the same reward centers in the brain and so forth. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cause and effect relationship here, but there certainly is this high correlation and high use of alcohol among people that are physically active, including athletes. So now let's look at how alcohol might affect performance. So we're going to look at first exercise during intoxication, okay? Now take intoxication here sort of light, okay, that basically while there's alcohol in your system, okay? These individuals are not really intoxicated, okay, but just using the term in that way. So this is the first study I've sort of found. It's rather old, okay, it's from 1947, and you see there's not a lot of subjects in it, but it sort of shows that when you have a sort of moderate amount of alcohol in your system, as you move across here, the amount of time it takes to do 450 revolutions go up. Okay, so performance decreases. What I thought was sort of interesting with this study is also some of the other stuff that they were giving to people. If you see down here, they're giving them cocaine to some of the subjects, and other ones were given strychnine, and if you don't know what that is, that's rat poison. So, I don't know that we could get away with doing some of these things today. And obviously having, 4 or 3 people in the study wouldn't really tell you much today, but I thought it was kind of interesting that back in 47, people were really interested in this. So, if we look at something a little more recent, we'll see here, now we're looking at cycling. So what if you are drinking alcohol or drinking right as you're exercising or right before you're exercising? And what you see here when you look at performance, okay, so here we have the alcohol in the open bars and non-alcohol in the solid bars, and then they took blood every 10 minutes in this 60-minute time trial. And what you see is performance is reduced, and at the same time you have a reduction in power. Blood glucose utilization is down, and blood glucose appearance is down. So it seems that in an endurance exercise here, you have a drop in performance that could be due to some dysregulation of your glucose utilization or glucose metabolism. Here's another study, actually a study I wanted to do, but someone else beat me to it while I was thinking about it, which may be a good thing. I don't know, we'll see. So it's interesting in this study. So here we're looking at strength while somebody is intoxicated. In this study, they actually got people fairly intoxicated, as I'll show you in a minute. So it's a little elaborate, so I'm going to explain the protocol over here. So they have them in, they do a test, a variety of tests, but we're going to focus on the strength test using an isokinetic dynamometer. Then they give them alcohol throughout the day, and then they test them again at the end of the day while they're under alcohol, and then on the subsequent days. We'll look at the days later. Here's the blood alcohol level. So they keep giving them alcohol to get them to a 0.14, which is close to twice the legal limit for driving. Okay, so this definitely is up where you were feeling it. Okay, and they kept them there, which is kind of interesting. So it actually kind of mirrors what a lot of people might do on a weekend night. Go out drinking and keep drinking and staying up there. So they gave them quite a bit of alcohol and kept them up, as you can see, for 6 hours. Now, what about the results from this? So here, there's only looking at what is the effect purely of alcohol on strength. So if we look over here, we can see that they did a variety of different tests, including maximal isokinetic strength, but there's no effect. So this is the before alcohol. This is while they're heavily intoxicated. Okay? There's no effect on strength. If we look at the days after, again, no effect on strength. So simply giving you alcohol does not appear to affect strength. Okay. Whether it was voluntary or evoked, they really saw no major differences. Okay. So no effect on alcohol on strength. Now, there's not a lot of studies in this realm, so we're going to move through some of these rather quickly, but it still sort of underscores what's going on. And it really seems that exercise while you have an alcohol in the system is when you do an endurance type exercise, there's a reduction in performance. But if you're looking at strength, which is probably more what we're interested in here, there's no negative effect, at least observed, from alcohol. Okay. All right. So now, let's look at what happens, not necessarily during hangover, but certainly after drinking, okay? So exercise after alcohol, so when the alcohol is no longer in your system, okay? You may or may not have hangovers, a little bit more how you feel, but certainly the system. And there's a little more work done here. We'll see a couple of studies, okay? So in this study, it's an early study from the 60s. They let people basically drink as much as they wanted. They had, for lack of a better term, an open bar. So the subjects came in, drank what they wanted. So you can see there's a huge range in what people drank. Some people drank 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. That's close to 20 drinks, okay? So you can see the 1.7 is about 13 drinks that they drank the night before. They had them back the following day, and then because they had a control condition where they didn't, that they was counterbalanced, et cetera. And then what they had them do was do an all-out sort of 5-minute exercise bout on a bicycle, okay? So high intensity, 245 watts, so pretty high intensity. And what you can see over here, this graph has a couple of different things in it. One shows the heart rate. So you can sort of see the dotted line here is doing hangover. The solid line is in the control condition. And you can see heart rate throughout was higher in the hangover condition or after drinking exercise. What maybe is more interesting is how far people went before they dropped out. So if you look over here, you can see in the control condition, 15 out of the 27 were able to complete it. But in the hangover condition, only 9 people were able to complete, going at 450 watts. And if you look at any sort of time throughout, you can see that people are simply dropping out earlier. In this, even though it's a very high intensity, it's still a little more of an endurance, still a 5-minute heavily oxidative exercise. So you really see a drastic sort of change in amount of athletes that are able to complete this workout. Now, you look at the work performed, that was also declined with alcohol. And as I mentioned earlier, heart rate was increased doing exercise. So several different markers here where alcohol had a negative effect. Now, in the same study, they also measured strength. So they had hand grip and a back pull, so the old school sort of pull on a chain where you have a scale under you. But you can see again, even though some of these people were severely hungover, okay, no effect on strength between the control and the hangover. Okay? they're the same. And if you look at power, the same thing again, although they looked at vertical jump, but it's a pretty good sort of indirect marker of power. Again, no difference, no difference. So again, if you're looking at strength and power, it does not appear that alcohol has a direct effect, similar to what we saw when you were exercising during intoxication. So to summarize that up, again, you see a reduction in endurance-type performance, although it's fairly short, but no change in isometric strength or power. So the same kind of thing, endurance-type exercise seems to be negatively affected, strength and power is not. Now, this is probably the most common mode of exercise and alcohol in combination, which is exercising first and then drinking after. If you're with a team, you're celebrating you won, you are whatever the opposite is when you lose, getting the team together, or now they have bars and gyms, right? There's several gyms now that have bars where you go work out and you can go right into the bar. There are a lot of people that go to the gym on a Friday before going out to burn off the calories for the alcohol they're going to drink. They even have a term for that called drunkorexia that's sort of being moved around. So there's a lot of this where after heavy exercise or exercise in general, people do go consume alcohol. So there's a few more studies on this because it's probably the most sort of common of what you'll see. Barnes, out of Massey University in New Zealand, has done a lot of this work, especially sort of started this off. And he's done a sort of series of studies with a few different populations and different alcohol doses. Now they do a very sort of heavy muscle damaging exercise. So they do 300 maximal eccentric knee extensions. Okay? So this is a very heavy duty muscle damaging model, probably not something that people are doing on their own on a regular basis. Okay? But obviously if you overwhelm the system, then you can see, does alcohol have any effect? And if it doesn't have an effect there, then it probably won't have an effect when you do something less invasive. Now I doctored their slide a little bit by adding in some things. I added in this non-exercise leg, so it's not necessarily a completely flat line, but it's pretty close to this, basically showing what we saw before. In the leg that didn't exercise, there's no effect of alcohol. Okay? So this is a non-exercise leg, which is similar to what we saw earlier. You exercise after, or you drink, the next day, 2 days later, there's no effect of alcohol on your strength. But here are your exercising legs, okay, these two. So this is the control condition, and this is the alcohol condition. Okay, so the solid bars here, or solid blocks, are the alcohol. And what you see is when you're at 36 hours and 60 hours out, so 1.5 days and 2.5 days out, you see that, yeah, you have a drastic drop in strength, which you would expect because you're doing a heavy muscle damage protocol. If anyone's ever done this, you can see people have a hard time sort of getting out of the room, okay? They're limping out. It's really, really heavy duty. So strength drops, not surprisingly, but as it starts coming back, you can see in the alcohol, it's dropping further than in the non-alcohol condition, and it's not recovering as fast. Now, the rate of recovery seems to be fairly similar, but it's even at 60 hours out, you're way below what you were in the control condition. So in men, they see a drop in eccentric, isometric, concentric strength, and they've shown this in a couple of different studies. Now, something to keep in mind is the dose that they're using here. They're using 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, which is a fairly high dose, okay? So about somewhere around eight drinks for the people they had in here, okay? When they did this with a lower dose, 0.05 grams, they did not see any sort of negative effects. Also, they looked at creatine kinase. There was no difference in creatine kinase, so it does not appear, at least, that there's this difference in recovery is because there's more muscle damage under the alcohol condition. Also, again, remember, they're drinking alcohol after the exercise. There's not really any reason to believe that alcohol would further damage the muscle tissue. Okay. So in this case, alcohol, and this is in men, delayed the recovery. Now, we've done this study again, but we were looking at women trying to mimic their protocol. What we found is a little bit different. You can see it over here. Again, if you look at the no exercise leg, no effect of alcohol. Okay? Now, we're looking at 24 and 48 hours out. We gave about the same dose, except we gave a little bit more, and we based off of free fat mass. Same 300 maximal eccentrics, blood alcohol level of about 0.09. What we see over here, so the open bars here is alcohol and the solid is placebo. So at 24 hours, no difference. At 48 hours, there's no sort of significant difference, although it looks like it's coming back up in alcohol actually faster than in the placebo. So now these are not different, but this is below pre. So it certainly doesn't seem to be the same as what we saw with the men in women. So at worst, I guess, there's no difference. At best, maybe alcohol improves performance or recovery in women. Okay? So there you go. Okay? So overall, again, said no difference between the conditions. Yes, the exercise bout reduces strength, but the alcohol does not seem to affect this. Now, another study found the same thing. Now, they're looking at men and women together. They didn't tease them out. But again, they see now not as much of a heavy-duty workout, more of a traditional workout, so not the muscle damage model that we were using, but the squat, leg press, knee extension, and they delayed their drink until 60 minutes after. We gave our drink 10 minutes after workout, so a little bit difference. But they see similar to what we saw. Yeah, you see a drop in performance, but it comes back up. Drop in performance comes back up, depending on the different alcohol groups. Okay, no alcohol, moderate alcohol, high dose of alcohol. But there's not. I mean, if you really look at it, the two alcohol groups actually have better recovery than the non-alcohol group. Okay? Now, they're not statistically different, but if you just look at the numbers, it certainly doesn't appear to be any negative effect here on recovery from the alcohol. Again, now keep in mind, this is not the same kind of muscle damaging model, and they're only looking at 12 and 24 hours. But again, found no effect of alcohol on recovery. So what about power? Okay, the other important aspect. If we look over here, so this is standardized back to 100. So the first one here, we have a pre-alcohol, and this is the pre-placebo. The green is the AM alcohol, and gray is the AM placebo. And AM means so the following day. So they did a 6x10 set of squats, a pretty heavy workout for squats if you've done this. It's hard to complete. Most of the time you have to drop weight. Came back the next morning, 12 hours later, and look at power. And what you see is there's a little bit of a drop in power, vertical jump, okay, jump power, but there's no effect of alcohol again, okay? No effect on alcohol in either condition. So again, even though it's a pretty good workout, this doesn't seem that alcohol is interfering with the recovery. Now, it's also important to note that on a scale from 0 to 10, they do rank their leg soreness pretty mild. Okay? Yes, they had some leg soreness the next day, but clearly this is not a heavy muscle damaging model where you're very sore. And these are all the studies I've shown so far have been in trained subjects, which is important to keep in mind. Okay? So, but again, alcohol does not appear to affect power acutely. Okay? Very good. So if we had to summarize this part, say that alcohol intoxication after exercise may lead to reduction in strength, or more importantly, reduction in the recovery, but only when muscle damage is present, and it only appears to occur in men. Okay? At the same time, strength and power, if there's no muscle damage, this really doesn't look like alcohol has any negative effects. So based on the initial findings from Barnes with the reduction in performance, we were interested in, well, what could it be that how could alcohol cause this reduction in recovery? Alcohol itself, no negative effect, might negatively affect your recovery. So we started looking at some of the different processes and biopathways that are involved in recovery. Okay? And part of that, we started looking at what are gender differences, okay? It seems that there are some gender differences occurring. What about dose? Barnes had clearly shown that with a lower dose, there was no negative effect, but with a higher dose, he had an effect. And then, if there's no muscle damage, there doesn't seem to be much of an issue. So we used a couple of different models, which I'll talk about here. So Now we'll talk about some of the physiological effects that might help explain what we saw. Okay? But again, for most of these studies, there were no negative effects of alcohol. So even if we find things here physiologically that's affected, the tricky part is, well, does it actually result then in a negative outcome? And that's, the jury on that is still out. Okay? If we look just overall at alcohol ingestion without any exercise, okay, so simply drinking alcohol, we see that you get a drop in protein synthesis, but no effect on protein degradation. So it really seems that if there is an effect of alcohol, it's on the protein synthesis side of things. Okay? Well, that seems to fit into our paradigm that alcohol is affecting the recovery, right? Protein synthesis is an important aspect of recovery from exercise. And if you give leucine stimulation, you still see this. Leucine is a very potent stimulator of protein synthesis, and in the presence of alcohol, leucine is not, the effect of leucine is also reduced. Okay? So, as I said, we really think that alcohol affects the synthesis, not the degradation. Now, there's a single study that has looked at this, exercise and alcohol and protein synthesis, but they used a mixed exercise model or combined model where they had aerobic exercise and resistance training together. What they did find, if you see over here, here's your alcohol and protein, here's your protein only, a resting condition and an alcohol and carbohydrate condition. What they see is if you give alcohol along with your protein, then you hamper or reduce, attenuate, the increase that you get in protein synthesis from ingesting protein. So with exercise, ingesting protein, we know, increases protein synthesis. If you co-ingest alcohol, you're hampering some of that ingestion that you get, or some of that protein synthesis increase that you get from protein and exercise. As I said, this is leg extensions and cycling, so this is really a combined, it's not really a true resistance training model. So for the rest of the studies I'm going to show you, we're going to look at how does resistance training or resistance exercise alone affect the variety of other pathways. So if we look overall for signaling for protein synthesis, and even though there's a lot of stuff on this slide, those of you who do this kind of research know that this is a vast simplification of what's actually going on, but for today, this is just to give us an overview. So you have resistance training stimuli, leads to muscle contraction, you get a hormonal response, and you get an immune response. Okay? Each one of those have implications downstream. And what we're going to look at today is how is it affecting the androgen receptor signaling, and how is it affecting mTOR signaling. And we'll have a little bit on how does it might affect the immune system as well. Okay? And this is where we have a lot of recent data out of our lab that I'm going to be sharing with you. Some of it we had presentations on earlier today, so it's pretty new. Ultimately, these lead to hypertrophy. But these are the two primary sort of pathways. Obviously, there's more than this, but these are two important pathways in leading to hypertrophy. So if you just look at ingesting alcohol again without exercise, testosterone, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in men. If you give a small dose, it can increase testosterone. If you give a moderate dose, it doesn't do much. If you give a high dose, it reduces testosterone. So the effect on testosterone in men is very much dose dependent. Now in women, interestingly, you see the opposite. That if you give a high dose of alcohol, women actually see an increase in their testosterone level. So it's almost like men and women are sort of nearing each other a little bit, but with the high doses, okay? Now, how does this affect the androgen receptor? We don't know that yet. Hopefully we'll get to that eventually. But we certainly know that it reduces protein synthesis. I showed you that earlier. So over here we have the mTOR signaling pathway, which was on the previous slide, which again, this is a vast simplification of what happens, but we're going to look at some of these targets, specifically mTOR S6K1 and 4E-BP1. But essentially, alcohol enters above AMP kinase, and through this, increases, that these are all representing phosphorylation of these targets. There's not more or less of them, but they increase or reduce in their phosphorylation, which turns them on or turns them off. Okay? So we see an increase in AMPK phosphorylation, reduction in TSC1-2 complex phosphorylation, which leads to a reduction in mTOR. S6-1 kinase goes down and 4E-BP1 goes up. ultimately all this leads to reduction in protein translation initiation, okay, and less protein synthesis. So that's the effect that alcohol has on this pathway. And if you've seen around, there's been several presentations today looking at this pathway. Because when you look at it with exercise, you see the exact opposite. When we have testosterone, we see, at least in men, usually a fairly potent increase. Now, there's obviously some debate going on right now whether that increase matters or not, but at least it exists. Most of us can agree on that. Okay? In women, you see either no increase or a slight increase in testosterone. With androgen receptors, we've seen in men an increase in 3 hours, and in women, no change about an hour out. Okay? There's not a lot of stuff that's done with the androgen receptor. Now, all of these are time dependent, and we certainly see an increase in protein synthesis, especially when you co-ingest protein or carbohydrates or both. So this same pathway, if we just looked at, resistance exercise affects it, but in the opposite direction of what you see with alcohol. And that's really one of the reasons we got interested in this pathway. It's heavily studied in resistance training and is upregulated by this, but alcohol has the opposite effect on the same pathway. So we're really sort of interested in what happens now when you put these two together. So web resistance training, you increase AKT phosphorylation, ultimately leading to increased mTOR phosphorylation, S6K1 phosphorylation, and reduction in 4-ABP1. Short story long, okay, you get more protein translation initiation and hopefully more protein synthesis. I know this is a very simplification of what's going on, but I'm going to talk about these targets right here, so at least now we have a better understanding of what's involved. So when we put them together, as I said, our question is, what happens? Okay? Does the exercise win out? Does the alcohol win out? Do they even each other out? What goes on? Okay? So that's really the question we had in a couple of studies. So Parr et al., who also did the study earlier looking at the endurance exercise and resistance exercise together and protein synthesis, also looked at mTOR phosphorylation, et cetera. They saw that from 2 to 8 hours out, there's really no difference, but when you compare the two to the alcohol with protein to the protein at 2 hours, you see a blunting or prevention, basically, of an increase in mTOR phosphorylation, and the same thing, but no effect on P70S6 kinase phosphorylation. So it does appear, at least in their model, that they saw a drop in protein synthesis, an effect on mTOR, but no effect on P70S6 kinase. Now, some of this might also be due to the model they're using. Remember, they're using combined resistance training and endurance exercise model. So we did this same study. We used a 6x10, or look at the same target, sorry. The 6x10, so 6 sets of 10 squats at 80% of 1 RM, which is a pretty stressful test. You do 2 minutes of rest in between. Most of the time, we end up having to drop the weight as we go through this. We gave a high dose of alcohol, and what we do is we give them based on body weight, or actually based on fat-free mass, but we give it over 10 minutes. So you're drinking this drink that, depending on your body size, is 5 to 8, maybe 9 drinks over 10 minutes. So, okay? And they start drinking 10 minutes after they're done with exercise. So, yeah. So we have men, we have women. Here we're looking at P70 or mTOR phosphorylation and S6 kinase phosphorylation. Okay? And if you look at the men, we can clearly see here in the white bars, which is the placebo, the gray bars is the alcohol condition. What we would expect in the placebo condition, you see an increase in mTOR phosphorylation, and it comes back down at 5 hours. So here's 3 hours, and 5 hours after exercise. Now, why did we pick 3 and 5 hours? And it's kind of late when you're looking at this pathway, and I think that's a fair criticism of this study. But you also have to consider it takes a while for the alcohol to get into the system. So it's one of those, if you go too early, well, there you're not seeing the effect of alcohol. And if you go too late, maybe you're not seeing some of the effects of exercise, but of course, you can counter that by saying, well, at least we did see a robust increase in mTOR phosphorylation. So it was happening, okay, in the placebo condition. But if you look at the alcohol condition, it's pretty much flat, okay? They did not do this on empty stomach. They had a standardized meal before they started. So no, giving people alcohol on an empty stomach is a little problematic, especially when you have them for 5 hours. So no, they had a standardized meal before. It was Ensure, quite a bit of protein, quite a bit of carb. So sort of basically a meal replacement based on their body weight. So yes, this is sort of co-ingested with protein. There's protein in the system. Obviously, you could give them an additional amount. But if you look at the women here, we see an increase in the control condition like you would expect, but also in the alcohol condition, the same kind of thing. There's no difference between the alcohol and the placebo condition. Okay? No difference. If you look at S6 kinase phosphorylation, you see again in the placebo condition, we see an increase at 3 hours, nothing at 5 hours, so it goes up and comes back down. But in the alcohol condition, it stays flat. Looks like it goes down a little bit, but statistically it's staying flat. Okay? Women, again, no difference. They didn't see any increase, but there also was no difference with alcohol. So from this, again, it looks like in men, alcohol reduces phosphorylation in this mTOR pathway. In women, it has no effect. So that kind of goes in line with what we saw earlier with the recovery piece, that in men, recovery is hampered. In women, it is not. So this could be at least part of what's going on, or help explain why it is that there are these gender differences. Okay? In a previous study, we looked at testosterone and using the same model, looking at, well, maybe something is going, so mTOR signaling, what about the testosterone signaling? Okay? Also potent stimulus for protein synthesis. Saw earlier that alcohol affects this, generally suppressing, when you give a high dose, suppresses testosterone in men. So we used the same model, the 6x10 squat, which we used for most of our studies. Same dose of alcohol. The BAC ended up being slightly less, but around the same again, 5 to 8 drinks drank over a 10-minute period. And we collected blood every 20 minutes, and then we pooled them into 3 phases, either 20 to 40 minutes, 60 to 120, or 140 to 300 minutes. And what we were expecting to see was that with alcohol, you would see a big drop in testosterone during recovery. Okay? But that's not what we found. So if you look at the placebo, which is the gray bar, so you'll see exactly what you would expect, an increase acutely with exercise at IP, and then it drops off at or below baseline. So classic heavy resistance exercise testosterone response in men. What we're expecting was to see the same and then a bigger drop off in the men. Instead, what actually sees is, and we saw this both in total and in free testosterone, is that out here, so 1 to 5 hours out, testosterone starts going up. And actually it was higher eventually than it was right after exercise. So we see a drastic increase in testosterone. And when this first came out, I remember one of the first things I read online was, I started, oh, alcohol, the new recovery drink, you know. I think that maybe is reading too much into these results, okay? But it certainly was sort of opposite of what we were expecting, and we were trying to figure out, well, what could explain this? But all the pathways that we knew of that alcohol affected would lead to less testosterone, not more. Affects the liver, leading to more aromatization, which means testosterone is converted into estrogen. Well, that doesn't explain this, right? It'd be the other way around. Alcohol affects the gonads, reducing testosterone production. Well, that wouldn't explain this, right? It'd be the opposite effect. The only thing we could really think of, obviously it could be something in the sort of feedback signaling that could be messed up, or it could be that testosterone is not being utilized, and therefore it's allowed to be circulate around in the system at higher levels. So one of the things we were interested in was looking at the androgen receptor and see, well, how is alcohol affecting the androgen receptor, which is the target of testosterone in the muscle cell, right? So, said free and total had the same path, same pattern. We saw no differences in estradiol or sex hormone binding globulin, which is the binding protein for testosterone, which either one of those, the difference there could have explained what we saw, but there were no differences in those, so they did not. So we really think that something might be going on with the androgen receptor. Now let's look at the women. Now this is a preliminary study because we only have 6 women enrolled, or 6 women that completed this. Now, if you look out here, you see a little bit the same pattern, okay? There's not much of an increase, but again, you wouldn't really expect that in women after heavy resistance exercise. But if you start looking at this same sort of recovery period here, you can see that alcohol is higher than the women are. Now, we're not running the stats on this because there's only six subjects here, and it could be when you add another 6 subjects that it flattens out. But it certainly looks like maybe there's something going on again with alcohol affecting testosterone, leading to more testosterone. Okay? So that led us to looking at the androgen receptor. So we used the same protocol again. We had 6 sets of 10 squats. BAC pretty high, okay, 0.11. Legal driving is 0.08. So clearly at this point people are under the influence, okay? They're not so that they're falling around, but that's a pretty good amount of alcohol. Now if we look at the women, interestingly, I just want to verify again, 3 hours and 5 hours after exercise. And again, remember, we give them the drink 10 minutes after, over 10 minutes. So they drink it right after exercising. So the blue line here is the alcohol condition. The red is the placebo. If you look at the women, you see an increase, and then it starts to sort of separate here, but it's not statistically different, although it certainly looks like there's a trend going on. But, okay, placebo higher, alcohol lower. But let's look at the men, where we saw some big differences in testosterone. So you have a significant increase with alcohol, or in the placebo, comes back down to baseline. In the alcohol condition, a drop-off and an even bigger drop-off at 5 hours. What we saw in the placebo was what we expected. Previous studies have found with this protocol, 3 hours out, increase in androgen receptor. When we give alcohol, we see a drop and an even bigger drop. Now again, we don't know if this is the cause of that increase, but it certainly sort of helps or adds to it. Say, well, we have an increase in testosterone, but you have a drop in the receptor, so it could be that the reason we saw that unexpected increase is because we have this drop in the androgen receptor occurring. And obviously it doesn't matter if you have a lot of testosterone floating around if you don't have any target for it to go and bind to, okay? Because that's how you get the signal. It has to bind to the receptor. So that's sort of where we're at right now in the androgen side of things. And again, interestingly, in women, it doesn't seem that there's the same negative effect, okay? So the last piece of the puzzle of the initial sort of overview I gave you was looking at the immune system. And we looked at LPS-stimulated cytokine production. So LPS is a potent stimulator of immune cells. They spew out cytokines at a very high rate. Okay, it's basically an endotoxin. And what we see, we've looked at a lot of different cytokines. The two we found differences were for IL-6 and IL-8. Again, you can see it's the same sort of standard protocol that we use in our lab. We're pretty good at getting people to this BAC because we use the same amount of alcohol every time. Seems to work quite well. It's just once you get a protocol down, you use the same one. And we're pretty good at dialing it in. And you can see over here with IL-6, this is the alcohol condition, the sort of open bars, that you see a drop at 3 hours, whereas in the placebo condition, you see an increase in IL-6. And that's what you would expect, an increase in IL-6. Now, once you get out to 5 hours, it doesn't matter if you gave alcohol or not, there's a huge increase. And that's probably just a matter of the immune signal or the stress from the exercise completely overwhelms at 5 hours anything that might have happened with exercise, okay? Because exercise is such a potent stimulator of this process that just overtakes it. And if you look at IL-8, you see again, here is the placebo, here's the alcohol. We see a greater drop in the alcohol condition than we do in the non-alcohol or the placebo condition. So it appears there are some effects as well on the immune system from alcohol or on the immune response to exercise with alcohol, which could have other implications for satellite cells and other things. And that's some of the things that we're wanting to move into going forward, doing some in vitro studies and looking at cultures and see what are some of these other effects. Because the problem a lot of times is people look at one thing and they say, okay, this is the end-all, be-all. Well, all these systems, remember, happen at the same time. So you really got to look at more than one system to get at the real answer or the complete answer. So overall, in summary, on the sort of acute effects of alcohol in the physiology, we see a drop in protein synthesis. We see no change in degradation, a drop in signals that are promoting protein synthesis, an increase in signals that inhibit protein synthesis. Now, this is without exercise, just with alcohol. Okay? Now, if we add resistance exercise to that and look at how does alcohol affect the resistance exercise-induced responses, we see the protein synthesis is attenuated, although it's only been looked at in a combined resistance exercise and cycling model. mTOR pathway signaling is reduced in men, doesn't appear to be in women. Testosterone late recovery is increased in late recovery in men and maybe in women. That's still, jury's still out on that. The androgen signaling is reduced in men, but not in women, and that may help explain some of these differences we see in testosterone in the men. And then we have in select immune markers, we see a reduction in them in the alcohol condition compared to a placebo condition. So I have a few slides on long-term training, and then I'll have some sort of cliff notes or take-home messages here. So what does all this mean? Because really what we want to do is this, right? We want to go from here to there. That's what we're all about. So what are some of these long-term implications? Not surprisingly, you can't really do long-term training studies, certainly not with students, where you put them on alcohol every day for 12 weeks and then another group that doesn't. So some of this still needs to be done, and so it gets a little tricky in that. But I have a couple of things here I want to share with you. So if you just look at, again, alcohol's effect, chronically and acute seems to be different. We saw acute, there was really not effects, there was no effect on strength, there was no effect on power. Now, if you look at sort of chronic misuse, it's quite clear that there are vast negative effects, which probably most people are aware of. And this is just myopathy, which is muscle wasting, occurs in at least 30% of people that are chronically abusing alcohol. And it seems to be specific to type 2 fiber. So it's a type 2 fiber atrophy. But obviously, if you're dealing with athletes, that's your high power, high force fiber, so that's a problem. And if you look around the world, India, Canary Islands, which is Spanish territory of Africa, Taiwan, United Kingdom, you can see again, sort of consistently, that in alcoholics, you have myopathy occurring in type 2 fibers. Okay? It's important to know this is not due to inactivity, and it's not due to diet other than the exercise. Other than the alcohol. So this is specific alcohol-induced effects. Okay? So we looked at this pathway before. Okay, so without exercise, alcohol reduces the signaling. Now, when you look at chronic alcohol use, you do have drastic reduction in protein synthesis in men. It's not quite clear in females, or just to say males, because it's looking at, these are all animal model studies. Again, it's not clear that alcohol is reducing protein synthesis in females. There seems to be a gender difference in how alcohol affects it. Okay? How resistance exercise mediates this is not completely known. Okay? Move on here, getting the signal over here. I will talk about one study that we did looking at chronic. So in this case, we used male rats that we squat trained for 6 weeks. Okay? We gave them a very heavy dose of alcohol. You can see they got 35% of their calories from alcohol. Okay? This is a sort of standard model you use that mimics what alcoholics, humans, take in. Now, a lot of people ask, well, how do you resistance train rats? And I generally tell people you need to have very small barbells, okay? But reality is not so fun. What we do is we have this cage with a light. You train the rats to stand, they have a vest on with a lot of weight in it, or you can add the weight. You train them to stand and touch the light when it comes on. That's 1 rep. Okay, they go back down, the light comes on, they do another rep. So you really sort of mimic a human squat in that aspect. So, but what we found here, we looked at the androgen receptor. The solus, which is in rats almost exclusively type 1, rectus, which is almost exclusively type 2, and both involved in the squat. We see that in the type 1 fiber, there was an increase in the androgen receptor in the exercise-only group. Okay? Whereas if you got alcohol, it prevented that increase. If you look at the type 2 fibers, there was an increase in exercise regardless. If you gave alcohol, it reduced androgen receptors. These are both alcohol. Whether you exercise or not, you see a reduction in androgen receptor compared to the groups that were either exercising or not exercising without alcohol. So in type 2 fibers, alcohol reduces the androgen receptor, sort of with chronic use, six weeks in these rats. Okay? So again, long-term alcohol use does again seem to affect the androgen receptor, which is sort of one of the targets that we're really interested in that help explain what's going on with testosterone. So we look at the sort of chronic effects. Without exercise, alcohol causes drop in protein synthesis and signals that promotes protein synthesis and increases signals that inhibit protein synthesis. If you add resistance training, the one study that we have done, we saw a drop in the androgen receptor content. Again, this is only in males. We haven't looked at it in females. And it seems to be type 2 fiber specific, which follows along with what we saw with alcoholic humans. Future questions, we'd like to look at different gender mechanisms, doses, protein synthesis after exercise, timing of when you drink, because a lot of questions that still need to be answered in this, and there's really, there's not a lot of research, despite how popular drinking is and exercise, and there's not a lot of studies that are done in this realm, and there's really a lot more that could be done. Mode of exercise, changing up the different acute program variables, so forth. How does all these affect each other? Okay? And how does alcohol affect the outcomes? Because that's really what this is about. But if I'm going to summarize what we have just with alcohol and exercise, there's higher use of alcohol in those who are physically active. Okay? When you look at performance, it seems like there's a drop in endurance-type performance, whether it's you drinking during hangover, whether you're exercising during having a hangover or during intoxication. There's a drop in the performance in endurance-type exercises, but not on strength and power activities. And when you look at alcohol ingestion during recovery, it seems it affects the recovery, but it has no direct effect if there's no recovery to recover from, right? So if there's no detriment, alcohol is not going to have a negative effect in a single bout of drinking. But this has only been found in men. It doesn't appear to be going on in women. So sort of take-home message would be, endurance-type activities, alcohol reduces performance. You're looking at single bout of drinking, strength is not affected unless you have some substantial damage you have to recover from, and then it really looks like only in men. If you look at sort of the physiological things, acute use, again, reduces protein synthesis and signals for protein synthesis, has effects on the testosterone signaling, has effect on immune signaling, but it seems to be more in men than in women. Again, you look at chronic, there's very little that's been done. We see a drop in in androgen receptors, specifically in type 2, and you see myopathy in type 2 fibers as well. So it does seem that there's some connection. So if you want to have a take-home message from the physiology, it really is that protein synthesis is being disrupted by alcohol. Some of the things that we haven't done and may not be able to do is look, so in one go-around, it doesn't seem to affect you much. But what does it mean when you do this over? What if you work out 3 times a week and you drink 3 times a week? How does that affect your long-term outcomes? Yeah, acutely, there might not be much going on, but if you have a small difference in your recovery that maybe is too small for us to statistically see, but maybe reality be there, if that adds up over time, what are the outcomes? Okay. And there certainly is also some endocrine disruption that might help explain why you have this sort of disruption in protein synthesis and protein synthesis signaling. But it appears across endocrine signaling, the mTOR pathway signaling, immune signaling, there are disruptions in that pathway, or in those pathways and those signals from alcohol, whether it's acute or whether it's chronic. So the question I posed first, I guess, is exercise and alcohol is a popular cocktail, but do they mix? The answer is not straightforward, and it really is, it depends. Okay, it will depend on the circumstances, the amount of alcohol you're ingesting, the context in which you're ingesting it, how often, and so forth. So it's a little more complex, but it's not as bad as a lot of people made it out to be. Okay? So at least that's the good news, right, sort of to end it all. I want to end by thanking my collaborators in my lab group. You can kind of make out in this picture, no, the lighting here is not great for it. Former and current students that help with a lot of the work that I showed here today, at least the stuff that's out of our lab. So, thank you. I think we have time for a few questions, maybe.
All right, as Dr. Hausch has mentioned, my name is Ethan Hill, and today I'll be talking about aerobic supplementation for men and women. Before I begin, I want to point out that the task of deciphering supplements that are truly beneficial for aerobic performance can be quite overwhelming. Perhaps that's why some of you are here today. So when I was presented with this task, I decided to go about it in such a way that I felt the typical consumer would do. So like Drake would say, I started from the bottom and worked my way up. I went to the weight room and I approached athletes and other aerobically trained individuals, which by my definition meant they could run, cycle, or swim better than the average individual. I'd approach a conversation with them, and when I felt like I gained their trust, I'd lean in and I'd say, "What you taking?" And I heard a lot of things you would expect to hear, like creatine, caffeine, beetroot juice, and others. I heard some home remedies, including chocolate milk and mini wheats, honey on graham crackers, and perhaps my favorite was the "I'm all natural, bro." And then they'd pick up their shaker bottle full of some precariously colored liquid and walk away. Nonetheless, I had a list, but this list was far from complete, and I couldn't tell you what actually worked. So I went a step further. I took my advisor's credit card. I went to local supplement stores, explained what I was doing and what I needed. Only 30 minutes and $300 later, I was going to qualify for the Boston Marathon. No, that's not exactly what happened, but my list was condensed, but still not complete. So I went further. I approached some local experts within the field, including Dr. Carl Foster, Dr. Dustin Slivka, read a few research reviews followed by a few dozen research articles. And what I have for you today is what I believe to be the most effective supplements for aerobic performance. Furthermore, all supplements talked about and discussed in today's presentation are supported by one of the three following agencies. That's the International Society for Sports Nutrition, the American College of Sports Medicine, as well as the International Olympic Committee. Okay, briefly, ergogenic aid and supplementation often get used interchangeably. It's important for us to distinguish, however, that ergogenic aid is a much more broad definition which encompasses supplementation. So when we talk about supplements today having an ergogenic effect, we're simply looking at the supplementation side of an ergogenic aid. Now, if I haven't bored you to death already, actually, before we even get started, in case you're wondering what aerobic activity is, which I actually question myself, those activities include running, cycling, swimming, and rowing, or any activity for that matter that can be sustained or is rhythmic in nature. Now, if you're still with me and aren't sleeping, the next two slides are perhaps the most important. That is, we're going to provide tools that allow us to effectively evaluate the effectiveness of supplements. So not only can we evaluate the supplements today, in today's presentation, but as we move forward as practitioners, coaches, and individuals, we can use these tools to actually decipher what's important and what supplements are actually working. So I found 5 indices that were commonly used in literature. The first one being VO2 max, which as we know is the maximum amount of oxygen that we can take in, utilize, and transport. The second one is the anaerobic threshold. The anaerobic threshold simply represents that anaerobic component or that anaerobic metabolism that occurs during aerobic metabolism, often signified by an increase in blood lactate or CO2 production relative to O2 consumption. The third one is the physical working capacity at the fatigue threshold. What this represents is the highest attainable workload that an individual can achieve before there's a significant increase or departure in some outcome variable. What I mean by some outcome variable is that PWCFT has been applied to electromyography and heart rate, for example. So if we did PWCFT heart rate, we'd simply look at the highest workload an individual could achieve before there's a significant departure in their heart rate. The fourth indice is time to exhaustion, which, as it sounds, is simply the amount of time elapsed before an individual becomes exhausted. The fifth one is time trial, which can be measured one of 2 ways. Either we give someone a set distance and time how long it takes them to complete that distance, or secondly, we give them a set amount of time and see how much work they can achieve during that set amount of time. So we have 5 indices. And the most important thing that we haven't really discussed yet is we have performance. But what actually adversely affects our performance? And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is using Edwards' 3D catastrophe model. That is, if we have performance on top, there are ultimately 2 factors that adversely affect our performance. That is, do we have enough energy to maintain our performance? And secondly, excitation contraction. Energy, for anything to occur, be sustained, there has to be some form of energy there for us to use. In humans, this is ATP. In cars, this is gasoline. Excitation contraction, broadly for our purposes, refers to any mechanisms that may inhibit normal healthy muscle contraction. These inhibitors, such as the buildup of hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, among others, have been shown to adversely affect our ability to consume or produce energy, as well as to efficiently contract the muscle. So with that said, supplements can ultimately fall into one of two categories. I'm going to talk about 7 supplements today that have been shown consistently in literature to show improvements in either our energy production or excitation contraction side of Edwards' catastrophe model, or those that act as alkalizing agents. So let's get started. The first one is carbohydrates. There are many great sources of carbohydrates, especially in the American diet. Fortunately, for aerobic performance, carbohydrates contribute to liver and muscle glycogen stores, as well as maintaining a healthy blood glucose throughout exercise. While there are extensive bodies of literature that support what type of carbohydrate you're consuming and the timing of that consumption, in general, a recommendation for aerobic trained athletes should be that they consume 55 to 65% of their diet as carbohydrates. Furthermore, there are timing considerations. Consistently, however, literature has shown that if we consume carbohydrates 2 to 3 hours prior to exercise, there is a performance benefit. Furthermore, if the activity lasts longer than 60 minutes, it is also wise for us to consume carbohydrates during exercise. When we look at performance measures, we have seen increases in both the time to exhaustion, time trial, and VO2 max, to name a few. For example, in 2012, McMurray demonstrated that consuming carbohydrates 3 hours prior to an exercise bout improved the time to exhaustion when you're required to run at 70% of your VO2 max. Furthermore, subjects who consumed the meal 3 hours prior to exercise, as well as during exercise, had a further improvement to their time to exhaustion. Now, we briefly talked about the types of carbohydrates. In 2008, Steffens followed this up by looking at the quality of carbohydrates. And what Steffens did is he had subjects complete an exhaustive bout of cycling. Following this exhaustive bout of cycling, the subjects either consumed a high molecular weight carbohydrate, which is simply a fast digesting carbohydrate, or a low molecular weight carbohydrate, so a slower digesting carbohydrate. And what Steffens found was those individuals who consumed the high molecular weight carbohydrate performed better in the subsequent time trial. Now the second one, protein. Like carbohydrates, there's many great sources of protein in everyday diet. As Nate has already touched on, protein assists with muscle building and repair. But in regards to aerobic performance, we're particularly interested in its glycogen-sparing effect, that is, sparing glycogen stores. A general recommendation for aerobically trained athletes is a little higher than the sedentary individuals at 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. If we look at performance, consuming protein or supplementing with protein has been associated with improving the time to exhaustion as well as time trial performance. For example, in 2011, Ferguson demonstrated those subjects who consumed protein prior to performing a cycling bout to exhaustion performed better. Furthermore, in 2003, Ivy did a study similar to Steffens in that he had subjects exhaust themselves on a bike, and following that exhaustive bout, they either consumed protein and carbohydrates or just carbohydrates. Those subjects who consumed the protein and carbohydrates performed better in the subsequent time trial. Now, there's also some evidence to suggest that essential amino acids as well as branched-chain amino acids may further increase our performance. That is, it has been suggested that consuming essential amino acids at 3 to 6 grams, in addition to carbohydrates, will improve the time to exhaustion or increase it. Furthermore, consuming branched-chain amino acids may help with the psychological aspects of fatigue or make it seem more easy to sustain a certain workload. Now, creatine. As Nate has already touched on, creatine is in everyday foods. However, to receive or achieve a sufficient dosage, this is most commonly and most easily assumed or achieved with supplementation. Now, we know that it assists with muscle building and repair, but in regards to aerobic performance, what we really care about with creatine is its ability to help athletes maintain their body weight and lean body mass throughout the competitive season so they can continue to have that competitive edge. As briefly touched on, loading could be achieved as consuming 20 grams for 5 days, followed by 2 to 5 grams thereafter. Again, this depends on the type of creatine. As far as performance is concerned, we've seen improvements in the anaerobic threshold as well as the physical working capacity at the fatigue threshold. For example, Stout demonstrated that 5 days of supplementing with 20 grams of creatine was shown to improve the physical working capacity fatigue threshold. Furthermore, Graf demonstrated that following 4 weeks of high-intensity interval training, those subjects who consumed 10 grams of creatine per day increased their anaerobic threshold over and above those subjects who did not. Now, caffeine, the fourth supplement we're going to talk about for energy production. Caffeine improves our central nervous, or it's a central nervous stimulant, improves coordination and reaction time, but it might also be the only reason that some of you are still awake throughout this presentation today. In regards to aerobic performance, we're interested in its effect in increasing fatty acid metabolism. Now, it has been shown that individuals may build up a tolerance to caffeine and therefore require an additional dosage of caffeine to receive the same ergogenic effect as before. But nonetheless, a dosage of 3 to 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight has been suggested. For example, in 2009, Ivy was able to demonstrate those subjects who consumed caffeine performed better in the time trial performance. And as early as 1978, the famous Kostel was able to demonstrate that simply consuming coffee 60 minutes prior to exercise improved the time to exhaustion. So we talked about Edwards' catastrophe model. We had performance on top, 2 other sides. The first one being energy. Supplements shown time and time again to improve our energy production, our energy stores, include carbohydrates, protein, creatine, and caffeine. Now, up until this point, we haven't talked anything about the other side of the triangle. That is, those supplements that act as alkalizing agents. So without further ado, I present beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is one of the 2 amino acids involved in the formation of carnosine. Once formed, carnosine acts to buffer intracellular hydrogen ions. Now, the direct consumption of beta-alanine, however, has been associated with an itchiness feeling, otherwise tingling, otherwise known as paresthesia. It has been shown, however, that we can eliminate this tingling feeling by consuming it with a carbohydrate, such as carboxymethylcellulose. If you're like me, however, the itching sensation associated with beta-alanine is simply a perk of its supplementation. And furthermore, the itching that I feel in my ears, I can use as an indirect indicator of the following workout I will have. In regards to the effective dosage, we have seen dosaging of 2.4 to 6 grams per day taken prior to exercise. With this dosage, we have seen improvements in the PWCFT as well as the anaerobic threshold. For example, Stout demonstrated in 2008 that consuming 2.4 grams of beta-alanine for 90 days was able to improve the physical working capacity fatigue threshold in older adults. In younger individuals, a more recent study in 2014 by Smith and Ryan demonstrated that consuming beta-alanine also improved the PWCFT. The second alkalizing agent or second alkalizing supplement we'll talk about is L-arginine. L-arginine is a semi-essential amino acid. It assists with creatine synthesis, muscle protein synthesis, as well as the synthesis of other amino acids. We could care less about that. What we care about is L-arginine's role as a precursor for the potent vasodilator nitric oxide. As we know, nitric oxide assists with the endothelial-dependent vascular tone, such that it has been purported that supplementing with L-arginine would increase substrate delivery to the working muscles and allow for a greater removal of metabolic byproducts. This has been shown that supplementing with 1.5 to 3 grams of L-arginine improves the physical working capacity at the fatigue threshold as well as the anaerobic threshold. For example, a recent study in 2014 by Zach demonstrated that consuming 3 grams of L-arginine 60 minutes prior to an incremental cycle test to exhaustion improved the physical working capacity at the fatigue threshold as well as the anaerobic threshold. Furthermore, in 2010, Chemic demonstrated that 4 weeks of supplementing with L-arginine at 3 grams per day was also associated with increase in the PWCFT and the anaerobic threshold. Now, the last supplement we'll talk about before we get to potential gender-related differences is sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is also known as baking soda. It acts very similar to beta-alanine in that it buffers hydrogen ions. The mechanism by which it goes about this is slightly different. That is, beta-alanine is a buffer of intracellular hydrogen ions, where baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, works to buffer extracellular doses of hydrogen ions. Now, a dosaging as little as 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. I say that jokingly, because anyone who's ever consumed 0.3 grams of sodium bicarbonate per kilogram of body weight per day knows it's probably just as easy to eat 5 dozen brownies. Nonetheless, if you can stomach this, Mueller has demonstrated in 2003 that this dosaging is associated with improvements in our time to exhaustion. So that concludes the second side of the triangle, with energy on one side and alkalizing agents, excitation, contraction on the other. Keep in mind there may be other supplements, but those that have been shown time and time again to act as alkalizing agents effectively and efficiently include beta-alanine, L-arginine, and sodium bicarbonate. Now, to get your money's worth, we haven't talked about any gender-related differences, not yet. There are a few that we may want to consider. That is, Tarnopolsky has demonstrated that women oxidize proportionally more fat than carbohydrates than their male counterparts. Part of these gender-related differences has been attributed to the hormone estrogen. Furthermore, Tarnopolsky has found that men and women do not respond the same to carbohydrate loading. That is, men carbohydrate load more easily than women. Thus, Tarnopolsky has suggested if women wish to also carbohydrate load to the same extent as men, they should consume upwards of 8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And finally, Tarnopolsky has demonstrated that both elite male and elite female athletes, aerobically trained athletes, require more protein than their sedentary counterparts. For example, males may need up to 100% more protein than sedentary individuals, and elite female athletes may require up to 60% more protein than their sedentary individuals. In addition to substrate utilization differences, Vislacki was able to demonstrate that there are also endocrine differences following exercise. That is, following a bout of exercise, women experienced increases in insulin, lactate, and glucose, whereas men saw increases in the growth hormone, but decreases in insulin-like growth factor. Nonetheless, both men and women saw increases in fatty acid metabolism following exercise. So there are substrate differences during exercise, and there are endocrine changes after exercise that are different between men and women. What the literature is lacking on, however, is the extent to which supplements may impact these gender-related differences, and the fact that some supplements may benefit men more than women. Therefore, if you find your research agenda going dead, perhaps consider looking at some supplementation differences between men and women in aerobic training. Furthermore, a recent study did look at pomegranate extract. This is a study in 2014 by Trexler. What they demonstrated was both men and women saw improvements in their time to exhaustion, as well as blood flow delivery to the working muscles. Again, that's just one study. We'll need some more before we have a definite conclusion to say it's worth your money. So if we go back to Edwards' 3D catastrophe model, we have performance on top. There are ultimately 2 ways in which performance is adversely affected. So we want to look for supplements that may improve our energy stores or those that act as alkalizing agents, promote good excitation contraction. And time again, consistently in literature, these include carbohydrates, protein, creatine, and caffeine. On the left side, beta-alanine, L-arginine, and sodium bicarbonate on the right side. And I couldn't go home without first saying there is no amount of supplementation that will compensate for an inadequate diet. Therefore, before you consider supplementation, make sure that the diet is not the first limiting factor of your performance. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, if you have any questions, please come to the microphone.
I was, a long time ago when I was an undergrad.
Okay.
We were told sodium bicarbonate loading was something to really try to avoid, that there was a danger inherent to it. Red blood cells swelling and banging off each other and clotting and causing a lot of vascular issues. And I don't know, I haven't seen a lot of more current research opposing that or anything, but could you talk about that? Is that still a concern, or was it misguided information from 15, 20 years ago? Is it?
Absolutely. I cannot entirely tell you the correct answer to that. I just went off of what the 3 following agencies suggested, and I just looked at effective supplements. In regards to too much sodium bicarbonate, other than having some gastrointestinal disorder and maybe decreasing the time to the toilet experience, I'm not familiar if there's any other adverse side effects with sodium bicarbonate. I wish I know you did some.
We believe it or not, we did a study in 1980 something, where I was fortunate to work with Herb DeVries, and we did a study on PWCFT stuff, where we did sodium bicarbonate and ammonium chloride ingestion. And sodium bicarbonate at 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight over the course of 3 hours prior to exercise. That's about a baggie full of capsules. So that's a lot of sodium bicarbonate. It's a lot of capsules. And so our problem, our issue was all gastrointestinal. Some people had no problems with it. Some people had a lot of problems with it. And so I'm not sure that there's any great long-term risk. People typically, sodium bicarbonate is not a chronic situation. You take it in an acute situation, but you have to take a lot of it. This is some of Kowalczyk's work, and I know most of the work has shown that sodium bicarbonate works in blood, to decrease pH, but it also works intracellularly too. He showed that many years ago, way back when can't even remember that far back. So I'm not sure that it's an issue because it's typically not chronic, not a chronic supplementation.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Hey, through your research and knowledge regards to beta-alanine, what is the recommended dosage or longevity of taking beta-alanine?
Okay, good question. We put up the effective dosage of 2.4 to 6 grams. Typically, this is advised to take 30 to 40 minutes prior to exercise because the peak concentration reaches about 50%, 30 to 40 minutes prior to exercise. As far as the longevity is concerned, to the best of my knowledge, about 90 minutes has been shown the beta-alanine is still effective, or is at least at the half dosage that it was before. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, like, should you take it 5 months, 4 months?
Great question. I'm not sure about the chronic use. I've been taking it for 6 years. I don't know. Maybe that's a good reason.
Maybe that's the problem.
No, good question.
I'm not sure on chronic. I'm not aware of any long-term adverse effects, but I can't say that there's not.
So, question about the arginine supplementation.
Yeah.
So, my understanding is arginine's the arginine conversion to nitric oxide is oxygen dependent.
Okay.
Does that take away from the oxygen you're taking in during that aerobic exercise in order to get that vasodilation, or is that kind of compensated for by the benefits?
Good question. Couldn't tell you for certain in exercise, but most often the reason that we begin to fatigue isn't because we can't get enough oxygen into our working body. It's more of a transport issue. Now, if that will adversely affect it by taking L-arginine, I wouldn't suspect that would happen, but I can't tell you definitively.
Again, I don't think the oxygen dependency is great enough to outweigh the effect. So the blood flow's greater than the oxygen usage.
Thank you.
Holy smokes, this is going to take a while. Come on up, Rick. He stands by the door so he can get out of here in case he wants to. Now he has to walk all this way.
Rick Ryder, Texas A&M. Good talk.
Thanks.
I was surprised you didn't talk about a couple others that may affect aerobic endurance exercise. First is sodium phosphate. Mm-hmm. Numerous studies have shown increases in aerobic threshold, VO2 max, endurance performance.
Okay.
Then beetroot juice or nitrates.
Yep.
And then the last one I would say is, you mentioned arginine, but actually L-citrulline is probably more effective in increasing arginine and nitric oxide levels of blood.
Correct. All great supplements, and there have been performance measures shown to improve with the supplementation of those. But again, I focused on only supplements that were shown to be effective according to the ISSN, ACSM, or IOC. With that said, my literature review and what I consider to be effective and worth your time and money included these 7.
You might want to read the ISSN again. Because
they might have sodium phosphate in there. Is that the one you're referring to? Yeah.
Read the Kreider review on that. Thank you, Rick. Anything else? Anyone? Okay, 5 minutes and we'll have our third presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. A very similar introduction. I want to let you know that it's an honor. It's great to be able to come here and talk to you guys here at NSCA. This is my favorite conferences that I've ever attended. I've attended quite a few over the many years in my medical background and now in exercise. And there's nothing like the people that are here and the diversity that's here within the field. We have everyone from coaches to personal trainers, strength and conditioning specialists, and then you have professors and researchers. So we have everything sitting around us here today. which brings such diversity when it comes to fields, especially things as unique as supplementation and controversial as supplementation, as you've probably already witnessed since we've already went over strength and endurance, and you've seen the questions that arise, a lot of different unique opinions and approaches to that. So today, instead of trying to push a lot of different really uniqueness, I'm gonna come at this as a really unique thing and get you guys hopefully thinking about this at the very beginning before we delve into exactly what I want to talk about and address today. And that's when I tell you supplementation for body composition, and you're going to go recommend something to your students or your clients or anyone that you might be working with, what would you think of telling them? You know, you don't need to yell it out at me, just think of it in your head. And chances are most of you are picking some type of supplement that's about fat loss. Some of you that are the strength guys, you might be thinking muscle gains. But typically the average person, especially in here, we're going to get a lot of diversity, but if we went outside and asked the average individual, they would start telling us fat loss, fat loss, fat loss. And with that, there's different ways that everybody approaches that and what you identify with it. And that kind of leads us into some of those gender things, which is if I was to tell you, okay, who would recognize the words, I want to go get toned, I want to tone my body? That's typically more of a female way to say it. If you say, I want to get cut and I want to get shredded, the guys would be like, okay, I more identify with that. So with that being said, we're going to be looking at the differences in supplementation and the way to approach supplementation for the genders. A quick little summary of what we'll be going over here is going to be looking at the psychological approach. That's a key thing, especially when it comes to the genders and the fact that all of us are professionals in this field, and the whole point is to affect others' lives and make them better. So if we have all the knowledge in the world, but we can't communicate those things, it's pointless. If we can't convince them and show them, hey, if you follow this regimen that I'm teaching you and that I want you to do, you're going to improve your performance, and they don't follow it, they aren't going to get those benefits. Now, next we're going to be looking at things that increase energy expenditure, fat oxidations, macronutrients, and micronutrients. So the first thing we're going to be going over are the psychological differences between the genders. And just to hit this home a little bit is, if anyone here is in or has been in a committed relationship, you know there are different ways the genders communicate completely. You will try and talk to your wife or your girlfriend, they don't understand. You try and talk to your husband, they don't understand. The same thing is in the relationship with a coach and athlete relationship, with your clients. And you need to know that. You need to step back and realize you're the practitioner, you're the teacher, you are the one they're looking to for guidance, and you need to adjust your stance to be able to communicate with them best. So we have to understand the basic goals between men and women. And these are the typical goals. Obviously, everyone has their individualistic differences between the two. Men, they're been shown to be influenced in their nutrition influences and their body goals by peers and self-desire. It's, I want to get bigger, I want to get stronger, or I want others to look at me as being big, being strong, or being in shape. They typically want to gain more muscle mass. This is opposed to women. Women, they typically want to have a lower weight, they want to be more toned, they want to look sleek. And women, they have a different drive. So when you're trying to communicate with those women, their drive for their nutrition and weight control is influenced greater by coaches, educators, and self-image. In other words, all of you out here, you could have a very positive impact teaching and educating the women that you work with. They're more receptive to listening to coaches and educators and all of you that are out here. So is that a good or a bad thing? Well, that's what we're going to look at. The fact that both men and women, especially women, are very influenced by the coaches and the people that they work with and their professionals, can that be good or bad? Well, we're going to find out soon that it's a little bit of both. It depends on who you work with. The second is that you need to provide thorough instructions. That is, if you just tell them, okay, you have to go and lose 10 pounds, and you don't give them guidance on how to lose their 10 pounds, or you say, I want you to go and I want you to get stronger, and you don't give them guidance on how to do that, how many of you think that your clients are going to be able to go and successfully reach those goals in a healthy way, where their performance is optimized? Very, very few. So we need to build that relationship with them, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And those relationships require little brief chunks of time. Not a lot, 3 or 4 minutes. So that's kind of where we're going with this. We want to look at those gender differences and look at the psychological approaches between the two. So a study was done, really, really unique and fantastic, where they put these big questionnaires out to all these collegiate athletes. And they asked them to say, what do you relate with out of this big questionnaire? And these are some of the responses, not all of them, just a few key ones, that women said significantly more than men and significantly. So most women identified with this, and more women than men identified with these statements. I'm not going to sit here and go through all of them. I want to poke out just a key few ones, and they're the ones that are bolded. And I do not eat foods that have 3 grams of fat or more. Well, all of us look at that and go, well, that's kind of dumb, right? Like, that's one of your major macronutrients. You want to have that fat. You need that. That's a healthy thing for you. But the uneducated, the people that you're typically be working with, they associate I'm eating that fatty food, that's going to be fat around my belly, that's going to give me a tire. We don't want that. So they don't eat it. The next is that they avoid eating meat in order to stay thin. They associate fat and then eating a lot of meat with increases in fat mass and increases in weight gain. Well, we know from all the iron talks that we've had just this afternoon that that is absolutely awful, as well as it's going to decrease performance, because where did we find out we get creatine from? Our meat. So now we're not eating meat, and we're not eating what gives us iron, and we're not giving us what gives us our creatine. So not only are we going to become more unhealthy, we're going to also become possibly anemic and decrease our performance. Now, the last one that's bolded is that I'm worried that if I were to gain weight, my performance would decrease. How many out here would agree with that? It depends on how you gain that weight, right? If you gain that weight pounding Krispy Kremes all day and a bunch of donuts, and it's not muscle mass, yeah, it's probably going to decrease your performance. But you guys are here to train them as strength and conditioning individuals, make them bigger, make them stronger. If you were to get your athlete an extra 5 pounds of muscle, do you think their performance would increase? Yeah, it's likely going to increase, right? Well, you're sitting here thinking, well, no duh, you're telling me these simple things. That's the point of all this. Your athletes, they don't know this. They might think they do, and you assume they do, but these studies are showing they don't. You need to be able to educate them with these things and give them the tools and the supplementation beyond a healthy diet to reach their goals. With the men, this is the same study. And now we're looking at something that the men said. And they asked them a question, they posed a question, in the past year, have you taken nutritional supplements for weight gain, weight loss, or performance enhancement? They said yes to that all day. That was just across the board. They're like, sure have. Because even if they aren't regularly taking a lot of supplements, guarantee you they tried some within this past year. And we know that a lot of the guys, they're the ones sitting there with their shaker bottles and taking a lot of supplements, and women take fewer supplements. It's also because less research has been done on women's supplementation, which is what we know of. The recommendations just aren't there. It's that gap we need to fill. Another thing is a lot of men, they say, I'm happy with my present weight. Women, they don't typically say that. They're constantly looking and analyzing themselves, and it's much more critical. So that's important to understand when you approach them. You don't just go up to the girl and tell her, you need to go lose 5 or 10 pounds now. Go. Get out. Make it happen. You're going to get better performance. Guys, you can tell them to that, and they'll be like, okay. The wrestlers, they'll go do that, no problem. They'll be happy to. So you got to understand those gender differences. The very last bullet point on this is something really to focus on. 88% of athletes report supplement usage, and men are 2 times more likely than women to take in supplements. That means if you were to take, and I'm going to round up to 90% here because 88 is pretty dang close to 90. If you were to take 10 of your athletes, 9 of them are taking supplementation. Or you're a personal trainer. 9 of your clients are taking all these supplementations. Students that are coming into advice, they're probably already taking supplementation. How many of you know what they're taking? How many of you have prescribed them this or told them, hey, this is what you should be going after to get the goals that you want? And know that that's what they're taking, and they aren't taking a lot of their other things on their own. Probably not that many. So this is something to get involved with. So another study looked at this, which blew my mind. I had to go back and reread this a few times. I was actually taken back. And I bolded these percentages. if we recall, women, they are much more responsive to their coaches, their educators, and anyone of a higher authority telling them that they look up to and they trust. They're going to follow their guidelines better than men. And it's not that, oh, they're more manipulative. No, they pay attention better than guys do. I'm awful at this. You could tell me what to do, and I'll forget by the time I walk out the door. So it's not that. It's just they're more diligent. They follow these things better. And guys, a lot of the athletes, they're very rigorous, and they do this as well. They just need to be reminded a little more often. But where are they getting some of these recommendations from? You know their fellow athletes are telling them what supplements to take and why. That's the whole thing in the gym. You got the gym bro going and telling you what to go take. Then you have coaches. They'd be like, oh, well, I've heard this thing works. Let's go take this. Well, they took a basic nutrition, weight management, and supplementation knowledge test. And they only got 9%, the athletes. These are the ones you're training that if you're not educating them on what supplements to take, they don't know what to take. Then you have 36% of coaches. That's someone that they look up to a lot. They address that person as being who their go-to person is. They're only getting 36% of the knowledge. Well, that's a failing score in my book. If you got a 36 or a 9% out of 100, you're not doing too well. You should probably go back and revisit some nutrition. This is a really good thing for us, so that athletic trainers and strength conditioning coaches, CSCS, ranked fantastic. And that's 78 and 82%. However, in my opinion, we should get that number up much above 82%, because 82%, that's a low B on that exam. We should be able to get an A. That's what we're all about here. You guys are all striving for the knowledge of this. So if they're getting their advice, especially women are getting their advice from coaches, and they don't know what they're talking about, that strength and conditioning specialist, whoever's working with them to increase their performance, they need to understand this gap. They need to approach that coach and be like, hey, just so you know, this might benefit your athlete. And have them start taking some supplements that might benefit them or address their diet. So, how are we going to do that? No one responds and is going to respond and make a lasting change just by approaching them and saying, hey, go take this, get out of my weight room. You need to sit there and talk to them. You need to invest in them. It only takes a few minutes. If I was to sit down with you and be like, hey, I want you to be the best that you can be. I want to do the best that you can do. I know you'll get there. And to do that, I think that taking this creatine, taking some extra protein intake, that might help get you there. So this is how much I want you to take. This is when I want you to take it. And I want you to try it for the next 3 or 4 weeks, and I'm going to follow up with you. And when I follow up with you, I want you to let me know how it's going, and I don't want you to have missed any days. That's going to make them feel that they need to hold accountable to that. But the other side of the sword is that you need to remember that in those few weeks away, you need to approach that athlete, and you need to tell them, hey, remember what I told you I was going to follow up with you? Have you been following that regimen that I made you? Because if you don't, they're going to realize you don't actually care about them. And it's that relationship that's going to build loyal athletes that are going to follow what you say. And then as they start coming in and new ones come to their program, the older ones that have been through this and you built this relationship with, they're going to realize that, oh, he actually does care about us and he is looking after our best interests. And that's what's going to build successful athletes in a successful program that's going to be at its peak performance. And that's actually going to follow what you say, because you only have them for a finite section of time. Whether you're a trainer, a teacher, a coach, or a strength conditioning coach, you only have a little bit of time with these people. You need to be able to help influence all those hours that they're away from you to make those right choices. So, with the psychological approach, we have those gender differences in the motivation. Men, they're much more structured. If you help tell them, hey, to help get you bigger and stronger, we can do this for you, they're going to be more receptive to that and be more willing to take it. Women, influenced by devoting more time to them. Just a few minutes out of your day, it's not much, and you're only going to be working with them every so often, so it's not a lot of time, and it's well worth it. It'll give you gratification, and they'll greatly appreciate it. Identify the gaps in education. We are here kind of in a false environment. All of us here know more than the average person that we're taking these exams from, for instance, that we are given these scores. So all of us are sitting there, oh, I would do really good on that test. Well, yeah, that's why you're here at the Strength and Conditioning Association. You need to take this back and be a positive influence in your program, wherever you're going from, to be the best that you can and build it to become the best program which you can. So build trust, build adherence to the programs and the advice that you give by being genuine. They can tell if you're giving them BS. If you're not truthful and it's not coming from your heart, they're going to know right away. So be genuine that you have their best intentions in mind, and give them a few minutes. It means the world to them, and it'll change their whole viewpoint of their program and as an athlete. So that's my spiel kind of on the psychological aspect. With that, we've realized that men typically want to gain muscle, women typically want to lose fat in the general population, and everyone wants to increase performance. And that's how we're going to kind of step forward with the rest of this talk, is that we have different things that drive genders for different goals. And we're going to approach supplementation for those goals, looking at it at a body composition point of view. So the first one is going to be something that helps us increase our energy expenditures. In other words, the majority of the energy that we're burning is our resting metabolic rate. So that's just us living, us just existing costs energy. As we burn that energy, we burn calories, and that's a fantastic thing. So how are we going to elevate that and increase performance? Well, we've seen that caffeine helps us increase performance already. And what caffeine does is you take in caffeine and you have adenosine. It's floating around. There's a lot of receptors in your brain for adenosine. Adenosine kind of calms you down. If you give someone too much adenosine, their heart stops. It's actually a way that we cardiovert people to reset their heart that have arrhythmias. So a lot of adenosine receptors in your brain and your heart, and it kind of mellows you out, makes you really calm. Caffeine gets you hyped up. How does it do that? It blocks the receptors in your brain for adenosine. So now adenosine's just floating around and can't bind. It can't create that calming effect. So if you're constantly at a slightly excited state, your body's metabolic rate increases. As that increases, your energy expenditure increases, your fat oxidation increases. So, fantastic supplement for both increasing performance and increasing your energy expenditure and burning some more fat. Though, I'm not giving dosages on this because there's a lot of different aspects of it. You have dosages that were given for performance, but then you have responders and non-responders to caffeine for general energy expenditure. And this goes for all the supplements that I'm going to be covering. And that's, you give me 1 cup of coffee, I am running up the walls, I am jittery, and I can't perform any work. I'm worthless. You give my buddy over here, Ethan, that just spoke, a couple of cups of coffee, and he's good to go. Doesn't affect him at all. His tolerance is way higher than mine naturally, even though we both have a cup of coffee every day. So, caffeine, fantastic for increasing energy expenditure. Another are thermogenic aids. There are a lot of different names for them, a lot of different thermogenic aids. What those are the typical ones that people think of when they think of the magic pills. I'm going to take these pills, they're going to make my resting metabolic rate all day spike and keep staying up, so I'm burning more calories all the time. How do they do it? Well, it's a mix of a lot of different ingredients. I threw the few popular ones up here on the board for you today. It's been shown in some previous studies that this has benefits over and above caffeine. That's because caffeine is just by itself, it works in its one way. Where thermogenic aids, they're throwing a bunch of other different things into the mix, and they work in different metabolic pathways in your body to help burn more calories. So by doing that, it has a greater effect over coffee. So there may be something to that. The next at the bottom is starting to become more popular. And it's really unique because you find it in energy drinks. If you look at the top of a lot of those big, tall energy drink cans and you're spinning them around, it'll be sitting there right on top. And people recognize that and go, oh, okay, it's something about giving me energy and burning fat. And guarana, it's really, really popular nowadays, and it started off in Brazil, and it's now worked its way all the way across the world. And it's this little fruit, this little red fruit, and they break it down, put it into a powder, and that's what they mix into the different drinks. And it hasn't really become too popular in the supplement industry yet, but it's slowly working its way there. And what people do is they buy them dried. It's starting to get popular to buy these little things dried and chew on them like a snack. And they found out that as they do that, it slowly is releasing these different ingredients, which increases your alertness, increases your mood, increases your focus because of caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine. So they kind of do that throughout the day. And that kind of reverted all the way back to the original days when they were taking this with hunters and things like that in South America. They would take and eat these things throughout the extended day to keep them awake for really long hunts. And so that's starting to get adopted there. So if you start seeing this become more prevalent, that's the thought behind it. It's just another caffeine source. Increase in fat oxidation. Now, when we see green tea, you think of the caffeine, but it has some other things into it because it's a lot of different herbs and has another physiological additive that caffeine doesn't necessarily do as well. So it acts as a fat oxidation. It also increases your mood and things like that. I personally am not a big fan of the taste. Luckily, they make powders for this. But it improves your insulin sensitivity and your glucose tolerance. This is fantastic if you're a personal trainer and working with people that might be sensitive and have diabetes. You might tell them, hey, have a cup of green tea every now and then, and it might help their condition. The other thing is that it inhibits the enzyme that degrades norepinephrine. In other words, if it doesn't break down as quickly, the amount of time in your body, it extends, and it increases the amount of fat oxidation that you have. Then I have two that I want to talk about, and these will be real brief, and it's pyruvate and vitamin B5. These kind of come and go and how popular they are, but there's little research done on humans, very conflicting findings, and there's a lot of negative side effects to them, such as nausea, vomiting, bloating, diarrhea, and which obviously all those things, I don't know about you, decrease my performance. I don't want to go work out if I'm vomiting or having diarrhea or nausea, all right? So I brought those up just because I've had a few questions recently about those. People saying, well, if your energy stores are all about pyruvate and that's what your body uses to help make a lot of energy, why not supplement with it? So we're burning more energy. Well, no. Now, increasing your mass, this is simple, and this kind of reverts back to you have the people that say, I'm a hard gainer. Well, there's not really such a thing. Just eat more. Put some more stuff in your face. But carbohydrates are a fantastic thing, and they make a lot of supplements now with carbohydrates. So whether you're eating them as regular food or taking and putting a scoop of carbohydrates inside some juice, either way, increasing your caloric intake is going to increase your mass. If you're training appropriately and you have a correct diet, you're going to increase your overall body composition. You're going to get heavier. That's a big thing for power lifters. They just kind of have that saying that as long as you get bigger, you get stronger. Protein. We've covered protein. I'm not going to go too in-depth in protein. And the idea behind it, though, is that as we intake protein into our body, we are increasing our muscle protein sensitivity. We're giving the building blocks to build more muscle. And there's different forms of protein. And one of the key factors they found is leucine. As you're having protein kind of taken into your body, leucine has been found to be one of those regulating proteins. In other words, regulating amino acids. And you can take less protein in as long as you have a high leucine content. So, for instance, if you take 10 grams of protein with 5 grams of leucine, that could be equivalent to taking 25 grams of overall protein. So leucine has been shown to have a really good benefit. Another is the absorption of protein. If you take protein and carbohydrates together, it's been shown to extend the time and that you're able to absorb that protein, extend the benefits of it. College students. Most of us are working with college students or people that might not have a lot of money. Nutrition content becomes very, very important. And that is that we know the average college person, a lot of athletes, studies have been done, they complain that they don't have enough money to eat right. They don't think that they could go to the store and they could eat the things that they need to. If that's a concern for you or you don't want to miss any of your micronutrients, just take a multivitamin, cover your bases. And it's been shown that most athletes that are on a regular diet, and then most non-athletes even that are on regular diets, they aren't getting all the micronutrients that they need in their body. In addition to that, fish oil, fantastic for your health. Fish oil is something you'd be able to take. It helps absorb certain nutrients. Certain nutrients need fat to be absorbed into your body. It's also been suggested that it possibly increases your performance, fat oxidation, and energy expenditure. When it comes to iron, I think the other two have hit home iron pretty hard. So the only thing I'm going to touch on when it comes to iron is that it's very beneficial to women, and that if you're anemic or you're borderline anemia and you're feeling that fatigued feeling, you can't have lactate levels build up as much when you're anemic. When your iron levels are low, you can't push yourself as much. Your lactate levels that you can sustain before you fail are much lower. And when you're fatigued, you're not going to be able to perform at your best and reach your body composition goals based off of that. So, main gender differences. When it comes to the body composition, the main thing is going to be the way that you approach how they take their supplements. We know, and we've established it from the past two talks and mine as well, you cannot have a good program without them taking their supplements and having good nutrition. They could have all the knowledge that they want, but if they don't apply it, you're not going to do it. Take those 2 or 3 minutes out of your day, apply that to your athletes, show them that you care about them and that this is important to them. Build that coach-athlete relationship, increase the education. Caffeine and thermogenic aids are fantastic. Green tea is a great alternative. And that your macronutrients, we should be looking at some protein and leucine, which we've both covered prior. And we want to be able to reach those macronutrients, so have them take a multivitamin. You don't want them to be deficient in anything. If they're deficient, they aren't going to have optimum performance, and they aren't going to be able to reach their goals. All right, and we've kind of covered those other ones pretty good with those other two talks. That's all that we have today. I want to thank you guys for being here. We're going to come up, have a quick Q&A. Don't forget about the supplements in the back for you guys to try.
Okay, questions?
Okay. If people didn't hear, the question was, he wants me to repeat and elaborate a little bit more on the protein with a leucine as well. In other words, what's the benefit of having increased leucine in your protein supplementation? And that's that some research has been shown that with leucine, that's one of the major regulators for being able to perform muscle protein synthesis and things like that. So you'll be able to take a large amount of protein in, but it may be dependent on the amount of leucine that's within that. In other words, if you took 10 grams of protein with 5 grams of leucine, you're going to get the same benefits, muscle growth benefits and health benefits, than you would if you took 25 or 30 grams of just regular protein without high leucine content. That's a great question. I am not aware if anyone's actually done studies looking at plant protein alone, because as we know, like soy and things like that, they're typically low in leucine. That's kind of one of the drawbacks of it and why people push red meats and fish and things like that, because red meats are higher in the leucine content, and why they suggest to recommend with it. I honestly don't know of any studies that have looked at plant-based protein with leucine supplementation, with high doses of leucine supplementation on top of it, to see if it elicits the same effects or not.
Didn't Kreider write a review on that? No? That's the only thing you have, Rick? Uh-oh. Leave a sleeping dog?
Love if you could weigh in on this one.
Yeah, if you look at, I believe it was either Bill Campbell or Chad Kurtzik did a review on protein timing and type of proteins.
Yes.
There have been some studies looking at soy versus whey versus combinations of whey and casein, and the key is that it's the amino acid profile and how much essential amino acids and the combination of slower versus faster releasing amino acids appears to not only have a effect on protein synthesis rates, but probably the more the interest now is on how to reduce catabolism, which is why they're adding some casein and other types of nutrients into the protein powders to have a kind of fast and slow acting combination. And so there's some pretty good data that that's probably the best approach. And give example, study we did way back, we did a study where we took 40 grams of whey, and we thought we'd super juice it with branched chains and glutamine and have like a super whey versus whey, and we added, our placebo was casein, figuring it was isonitrogenous. And we get the study done, and guess what group did better? It was the combination of casein plus whey versus the adding all the other amino acids, because the whey protein itself has a lot of those essential amino acids. So we're learning the combination is probably the most important factor, and probably moderation and blending, and maybe more casein and slower acting anti-catabolic proteins at night versus the faster acting before and after exercise to really get the maximal stimulus and reducing catabolism.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
We're certainly not at a point where we can make that judgment yet. I mean, exactly how to mix the supplements to make them everything we want. That's what we're doing.
Solely plant-based proteins. That's kind of where there's also a big gap. Most are using plant proteins that were derived some way from animals. So.
Other questions, anyone? Thank you, presenters. Did a great job.
Good afternoon. I hope this, can you hear it? I can't. Okay, so we're gonna walk through a bunch of stuff. I'm gonna try and keep what I would call the boring stuff to a minimum and give you guys a lot of takeaways so that you can go home with something that you can implement right away if you need to or want to, and then we can answer questions as we go. Here's my lay of the land. We're gonna start with the science. I'm gonna translate the science because I do everything at I say kindergarten level. I don't like the super extra fancy stuff. From there, we'll talk about the practical info and then stuff that you can take away. Don't freak out. We're gonna review some random things. Starting with, what is the point of recovery? The whole point of recovery for us is keeping our people on the field as much as possible. We want them on the field when we need them so that they can compete. So how do we do that? We want the process of inflammation to occur. What is inflammation? Overall, it's happening in my body. What it's doing is repairing my muscle injury. It's going to repair my tissue damage. I'm going to refill my muscle glycogen. I'm going to start up my protein synthesis. I'm going to do my immune system, get it moving, and I want to perform day to day, all the time, consistently, not really good on Monday and really terrible on Friday. So I need to be able to consistently compete throughout the week. Here's my boring. Blah, blah, inflammation. Stress on my body that's causing irritation. Overall, it's just a protective measure of my body to say, please stop and pay attention to what's going on right now and fix this before it becomes an issue. So it's a natural part of my immune system against all the yucky stuff that's floating out there, whether it's from lifting, whether it's from life, whether it's from school. All that stuff is causing a stress in my body, which is then causing inflammation in my body. So when is this a problem? If I want inflammation to happen in my body, when is it becoming a problem to my body? And the answer to that is when, because we have inflammation all day. All of you guys sitting here right now have some type of inflammation in your body. The reason it becomes a problem is when you no longer have the ability to get rid of that inflammation and repair and recover. And then all of a sudden, we have it all the time where it then leads to injury or illness. So here's my translation to all of that. Our bodies and those of our athletes are constantly in a state of irritation. Everything that they do is a stress, from homework to their girlfriends, to their boyfriends, to lifting weights, to their sport. They're constantly under a stress that we then have to counteract through nutrition, I say, of course, through nutrition and sleep. And those two components should be able to help me fight that inflammation to be able to keep me on the field and keep me competing as much as I possibly can. So our job is to help them manage to do that because, when I'm 18 to however old, I know everything and I'm invincible, so I don't have to take care of my body, so I don't have to go to sleep, and I can eat McDonald's all the time and think that I'm totally fine. So how do we counteract that? So our nutrition can help overall by talking about nutrient timing. When am I supposed to take carbohydrates? When am I supposed to take the protein? How much is going to be the right amount for me? What foods am I supposed to eat that are going to help me strengthen my immune system overall? What foods are going to help me fight off that inflammation when I know I'm putting it on my body on purpose? What's going to help me fight off that inflammation from there? And then also supplements. Not my favorite thing to talk about for high school athletes. We'll talk about it a little bit, but it's not going to be something that I say, yes, go ahead and do it right away. So here's my foods that increase inflammation. Pretty much the diet of every college and high school athlete anywhere. Anything fried, anything high, super high in saturated fat, anything high in trans fats, pretty much not a fruit or vegetable in sight. This is the kinds of foods that we're looking at that are making up, I would say, probably at least 50%, if not more, of the diet of our athletes. So we're telling them we need to keep you healthy and help you recover, and this is what they're putting in their body overall. That's why it's easier from our piece, from the nutrition piece, to be able to say, let's go ahead and start fighting inflammation by step one. Let's take one of those foods out of your plate and replace it with something else that's going to help you fight it. So these are the foods that increase inflammation. These are the foods that make inflammation go away. Fish, salmon, tuna, mackerel, tart cherries, blueberries, all the fruits and vegetables, I would say overall. Just think of that, all fruits and vegetables. All the nuts for the omega-3s, avocados with the healthy fats. We're looking for good stuff to put in our body. Thinking in your head, pretty common sense. If it's going to taste good for my body, if it's something I've been hearing about since I was little, I probably should put it in my body and make sure that it's helping me. I know it's doing something, just know that it's helping them recover. Your job is now, how in the world am I supposed to sell that to kids that don't listen to anything and think that they already have it all figured out? So that's my thing. Basic education for them that they can remember. The only way they're going to remember it is if you apply it, like literally apply it to themselves, that they can apply it right now and leave, which is what I'm going to try and have you guys do right now. I want you to remember something out of this presentation, so I'm going to give you little pieces of information that you're like, oh, I can do that part of it. So you want to do that to them. Our goal overall, information they immediately relate to, keep them on the field and able to compete all the way through the end of season, not just at the beginning. But I also want them to be feeling relatively pretty good by week 12, same way that they felt during like week 2 or 3. So great if they're on the field at week 12, but if they can't hardly move and we're just using them, that's not really helping us either. I always tell them, don't be the best unavailable athlete. That can refer to, I'm cramping on the sideline, can't put you on the field. I got sick and I have constant sickness all the time. I have strep and I have to miss a game. I have the flu. Whatever it is, there's a lot of reasons, but don't be the best unavailable athlete that we have. So how do I do that? We optimize their food choices. I'm probably the most dietitian you'll ever meet in your life. I will never tell them to go out there and eat all healthy foods all the time. Reason being, I'm not going to do it. I have M&Ms for dinner sometimes. Sometimes it's Cheez-Its, and that's my whole thing. I get it. They're going to do it. All I want them to do is eat, pick some foods in that meal that are going to help them overall, and some foods that they like. As long as we get a good mixture, we're doing pretty good. I consider that a win. We'll talk about the nutrient timing, and then we'll talk about the sleep. So here we go. This is how I do it. We have an acronym that we call BEAST. Those are the 5 things that we feel like are most important for our athletes to be able to succeed nutritionally. You can make up whatever acronym you want to, whatever school, however it is, you can tell me, I'll make one up for you, but this is how we go through it. B is for breakfast. We'll go through these in detail. The E is eat often. The A is always hydrate. The S is sleep. And the T is think lean protein. I do not care if they remember absolutely nothing that I say after this. I talk to our athletes literally 100 times a year. Every single week we're talking once or twice a week about something, but everything relates back to the BEAST. So you don't have to remember anything from freshman to senior to professional career to career outside of sports, anything about nutrition except those 5 things. And that's our overall goal, as easy as I can possibly make it for them. So why did I pick these things? Breakfast, most important part of the day. Somebody tell me why. Because I'm breaking the fast. What I tell them is overnight, things are not stopping in my body. My heart is still beating, all of my organs are repairing and trying to get ready for the next day. My brain is repairing, getting ready for the next day. So what that means is when I wake up, I have 0 carbs in my body. Yes, I'm exaggerating slightly. But to them, I have 0 carbs in my body. My body is empty. I have nothing to use. If I go to work out right now, my body is going to choose to use protein as my source of energy. As an athlete, I would rather not lose this protein source of I'm trying to build that right now. So why would I want to lose that? To them, that sticks in there. If I'm burning protein, I don't want to do that. I want to have big muscles. I want to be strong. So I'm going to make sure I have breakfast. So we say breakfast within 30 minutes. I don't care what you eat. It could be gummy bears. Do it. Chocolate cake. Have fun. I don't care. Whatever you want to do, something is better than nothing. The biggest thing being, if I have the option between having something like eggs and toast versus a piece of chocolate cake, I clearly want them to choose the eggs and toast. So once we get them in the habit of something is better than nothing, just put something in your body, then we work on now what should it actually be made up of when I'm having a breakfast. So it's not appropriate to have chocolate cake forever if you know better than that. Eat often, because I want energy when I actually need it. We actually recently changed this too to eat fruits and vegetables often. Reason being, I want you to get fruits and vegetables all the time because I'm trying to get you to recover. Our biggest focus, again, is recovery. So how am I doing that? Every time I eat, we tell them every 3 to 4 hours, I want you to have a fruit or vegetable in there. I'm never, ever going to tell them, get 10 servings of fruits and vegetables. I don't know how many servings of fruits and vegetables I eat. If I'm not doing it, I'm supposed to love this more than they ever will. Why would I ask them to do that? So I tell them, if every time you're eating something, whatever you have, include a fruit or vegetable in there, and we're good. We're winning. We talk a little bit about plates and how we want them to fill their plate, and I mentioned it just a second ago for the breakfast. Again, I don't write meal plans for them very often. I won't give them calorie counts. I won't have them weigh foods. I don't do stuff like that. Again, because I won't do it, so why would they ever want to do that? What I'll do is do this. This is what I want your breakfast plate to look like. So this kind of slides in. Right now it says breakfast. We slide it around a little bit and change it to different things. This is also my weight gain plate. This is also I have a day of competition tomorrow plate. This is also I'm trying to gain weight. That's my plate all day long. It's also, it can be a wide variety of things. We switch out the title a lot, but for the most part, what I'm looking at is half of my plate is carbohydrate. And not even just carbohydrate, but starch. I need grains in my body to help me compete. When they come to me and tell me about some special diet, excuse me, that someone told them about, that does not include carbohydrates, then we have a conversation about energy for your muscle. That's all I want you to remember. Carbohydrate, energy for your muscle, done. Don't learn anything else about it. That's all I care about right now. So for them, that's what I need the most of in the morning. Half my plate is carbs because I'm empty. Fruits and vegetables. Vegetables are optional. Fruit and then protein. My lunch plate's going to look a little bit different. So the 3 plates that I'm showing you that say breakfast, lunch, and dinner right now is for someone that just wants to maintain. I just want to get a good overall healthy diet. So I cut down the carbs a little bit because I have a little less to do during the day. I don't need, at breakfast, I have everything after the day. I have a practice, I have school, I have homework, I have whatever. But after lunch, I have a little bit less. I might have practice and homework, etc., but I already covered some of that in the morning too. So a little bit less, so I increase my fruits and vegetables because I need the nutrients to help me recover. And I decrease my starch. Notice that my protein stays the same all the time. So I'm not messing with that too much. And then my dinner plate, depending on if I'm a weight loss or weight maintenance person, we'll slide around the carbohydrate a little bit. But protein stays the same, 1/4 of a plate. Half of my plate is fruits and vegetables, and then I go with my starch on the top for another 1/4. So that's how we do meal plans. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to do a black, a yellow, and a yellow. That's your meal plan. Go do it. I'm in the dining hall. What plate should I do? Gray. Fill it. That way they don't have to think, oh, calories, I'm supposed to have 500 in starch. Who does that? I know you guys don't have time to do this, but this is the meal plans that I give them. So what we do is I tell them, and I have them do that. So they'll walk in and they'll say, I want a meal plan. Great. Give me your schedule of everything you have to do during the day. How often are you supposed to eat? Well, I'm supposed to have breakfast within 30 minutes of waking up. Good, put it on there. Breakfast. Wake up at 5:30, I have breakfast at 6. Then I go and do whatever I'm doing, okay? How often am I supposed to have between meals? How much time? 3 to 4 hours. Good, when's your next meal? Put it on there. When's your next meal after that? Put it on there. Okay, now I have 12 o'clock and I have practice until 8 p.m. Okay, so what are you supposed to do? Well, I have to eat every 3 to 4 hours. Right, so what do? I put a snack in there. Yes. So then they just walk through that way, and once you write it down, for some reason, it's magically very easy. And then I just attach the plates to the back of that, and they're good to go. So you can have an entire team do this at one time if you just print off, that's just an Excel sheet. So if you just print off an Excel sheet and just say, okay, put in there, what time do I have wake up in the morning? What time do I have practice in the afternoon? What time do I have school? What time do I have class? Whatever it is, fill out the sheet, leave some blanks in between, and then plug in the meals. Excuse me. Hydration, my favorite thing to talk about. What I tell them all the time is if I had a piece of raw steak and I passed it around the room to all of you, everybody touched it, and then I wanted you to put it on a plate right back up here, it's going to look pretty similar to the way it did when I handed it out the first time. Very flexible, very pliable. It's going to be very elastic in terms of being able to stand up to any type of stress that we're giving it in here. Put it back on here, it looks good. That's my hydrated muscle. If I took a piece of beef jerky and passed it around the table, it would probably be smaller when it came back, in a different shape. There'd be pieces left all over the place. And I tell them that's their dehydrated muscle. So do you want steak muscles or do you want beef jerky muscles? You guys decide, hydrated or dehydrated. But the picture in them for them in their head, I mean, of course I want to be a steak, I don't want to be a beef jerky. Another easy way for us to do hydration, I put these in the bathrooms. We made our own, modified it off of stuff that's online, added some information. And pretty much what I tell them is, if your pee's lemonade colored, good job, keep doing it. If it's more like apple juice, time to start hydrating. Okay, so everything that we're talking about on these is all about, as much as I can, is recovery as much as I can. So hydration helps me recover. Breakfast helps me recover. Making sure I eat the right fruits and vegetables helps me recover. So all this is leading up to the whole point of keeping you on the field as much as possible. Sleep, which they never do. So if they aren't recovering, I don't really care how hard you're training. If you're not going to bed at night, nothing that we're doing in the weight room is going to help you. You're not going to get faster. You're not going to get stronger. Your nutrition can be great, but if you don't have time overnight to repair and recover, nothing's going to be happening in your body that you want it to. So we need to aim for sleeping-wise. We're aiming for 7 to 9 hours. Knowing that they're not going to get that, then we talk about naps. We do a lot of informational talks. We talk for multiple times. Our applied department talks a lot about this as well. We'll kind of tag team the whole issue of sleep in general, talking about the best way to sleep, talking about the best temperature to sleep, and then I'm just talking about the length of time. So I throw out to them all the time that it can give you a 10% increase in stamina, 10% reduction in injury. My favorite one is number 3. So there's always little dings and things that happen through the season. You stay more sore when you're not sleeping. Just like when you're not hydrated. You stay sore when you're not hydrated, you stay sore when you're not sleeping. Because when is your body repairing if you're not doing that? It can't happen. So, slows the healing in the body by approximately 10 days. That's a long time. So if I have a game on Saturday and I feel terrible on Sunday, I don't really want to feel terrible by the next Saturday again. I want to feel a little bit better than I did on Sunday. I would like to get it all out of my body, and the best way for them to do that, go to bed. This is another funny thing that I teach them. We call it the law of the legs. How many legs does a cow have? Yeah, you have to tell me. 4. How many legs does a chicken have? And how many legs does a fish have? Easy way for them to decide, what am I supposed to eat in a restaurant? The less legs an animal has, the better it is for me. The leaner that animal is. The less legs an animal has, the leaner that it is. So because I can't be in their pocket all the time and come with them and smack things out of their hands and put things on their plate, I have to tell them when you're in a restaurant, how do I know what I'm supposed to eat? Go with less legs. A lot of times we'll tell our weight loss guys, I want you having 2 legs or less at least 4 days of the week. So again, I'm not telling them what to do, but I'm telling them what to do. So it's an easy way for us to communicate to them, a good way for them to make choices on the road or when they're eating fast food, etc. I also tell them once the food is fried, it's out the window, and I don't know about shrimp, so don't ask me. Pretend it doesn't have legs. So for you guys, baby steps. This is all I teach them about carbohydrates. It is your energy. Give me one word that describes carbohydrates. Energy. That's all I want you to know. Then we talk a little bit about the calories. We talk a little bit about providing fiber. So what are our best sources? We talk about them for carbohydrates. We're talking about fruits and vegetables. We talk about grains. Those are the only 3 sources of carbs. So we want to make sure that we're getting the best ones, not the ones maybe that come in a box. When is the most important time to eat carbs? So I ask them during a pre, during, or post, what's our most important time? Pre, because then it's my energy. Carbohydrates is energy, therefore I want it pre. I need to get some carbs in my body pre-workout. Of course you're going to get them post too, but I want them to focus on one thing at a time. So your main focus pre-workout is going to be carbohydrate in my body. What does that mean? It means when I wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to have to eat for that workout, I would like you to have a banana versus a chicken breast. Okay, so I'm just trying to give them easy ways to remember things. Protein. The purpose, recovery. That's it. Just remember that and you're good. Also helps us fight diseases, etc. What are my best sources of protein? Now you guys know, so tell me. Less legs. Less legs. And then when is the most important time for me to eat protein? If I'm doing it for recovery, when is my best time? After. So I'm trying to aim for after. Do you guys know how much protein I'm supposed to be having per day? Again, think easy. I'm sorry, say it again. Yes, I think that's like for power athletes or something, right? Think easy. What am I trying to say? I'm easy. Yes, 1 gram per pound. That's it. Give me 1 gram per pound. I weigh 165 pounds. I need 165 grams of protein. How am I going to do that? I'm going to eat protein every time I eat. Well, how often am I supposed to eat? Every 3 hours, every 3 to 4 hours. If I get my protein in every meal and every snack, I'm going to reach my 165 pound goal or my 165 gram goal. Okay, so I just have to make it very easy for them. We can do the complicated way, but they can't do the complicated way. We want to make it as easy as possible. Fats we don't talk about too much other than the fact that it is necessary for them. So when they come in, we have a DEXA machine, and we do their body composition on the DEXA machine, and it gives me their body fat percentage. And they come in and say, I want 0% fat. Yes, well, you would be dead. So no. So it is important, and we talk a little bit about why maybe that's important. So it's cushioning us, it protects our organs. My brain needs it to be able to transmit information, insulation overall. So what are my best sources? I'm aiming for things like salmon. I'm aiming for things like avocado. I do want them to eat red meat, so I'm going to tell them to choose some leaner cuts of beef. I want them to get that in their body. But again, I'm not going to stop them if they say, well, I'm going to have fried chicken every Tuesday. Okay, good. Do it. Just throw some vegetables on there and I'll be really happy. When is the most important time to avoid eating fat? Anyone know? There's 2 that I would probably talk about. One that revolves around competition and one that revolves around just a day-to-day. So during competition, I want to avoid it the day of. So my pregame meals and the meals that I have for breakfast are not going to be full of fat. It's not going to be full of grease or fat. I'm going to stay away from pizza. I have a lot of high school teams. Their moms ask me, what should we serve as our pregame meal? Can we do pizza? Can we do like a lasagna? It depends on how you're making it, but just remember, heavy makes them heavy. So heavy food makes them heavy when they're running. Your body kind of looks at fat kind of like a poison. Get it out as fast as possible. So while you're thinking about, I'm going to play football, your body's thinking, great, let's get this out first before you play football. So we try to keep it as lean as possible. That's why they say pasta. You can do some meat sauce on there, but we're trying to keep it a little bit leaner. Day to day, I'm trying to avoid it at bedtime. Why am I trying to avoid it at bedtime? Because I'm trying to repair and recover. I want to use stuff. I don't want it to sit heavy in there and my body think, forget the repair and recover, let's get rid of this first. Well, now it's 6 in the morning, I haven't done the repair and recover, I haven't been able to utilize the good stuff anymore, so I want to avoid it before I go to bed as well. Stipulations to that would be, obviously, weight gain people. I would like it to sit in your belly a little bit longer. Water. We talk to them about water constantly. Are there ways, this is my favorite, I hate water. What am I supposed to do if I hate water? Are there other ways to get hydrated without drinking water? Yes. Everything that you're drinking is hydrating you overall. You can eat fruit, you can drink soup, you can add in a bunch of different stuff, and you can add in Crystal Light to your drinks if you want to. Overall, just yes, there is ways to do it. Just know that water is the best, is the best, is the best. How do you know you're getting enough? Now you guys know. It's based off the P chart. Lemonade colored good, apple juice bad. See how easy this is? You guys are experts already. This I'm just covering overall because I know that you guys are going to get this question. Vitamins and minerals. Do I want them to take these? Do I want them to take a multivitamin? My answer is yes. Reason being, if I asked you in here right now, raise your hand if you eat perfectly all the time, nobody's hand is going to go up, including mine. So that's why we do it as an insurance policy to make sure that we have everything we need in our body to make sure all the processes are working so I can be bigger, faster, stronger, so I can recover and stay on the field, so I can stay healthy and not get sick. Oh yeah? Oh. So minerals overall, same thing. We talk a little bit about those to them just in terms of calcium and iron. I want you to eat red meat. I want you to eat red meat. Females, please eat red meat. Males, eat red meat. I want you to do that because it's carrying the iron in your body. I am not saying don't eat steak. I am not saying don't eat anything that has 4 legs. Please eat bacon and sausage, but we're going to do it at certain times. So there's times that are better than others. They ask me for grocery lists all the time. Here's what I give them. So this is not just 25 foods overall. This is 25 categories of foods. They are ranked, well, the first one's ranked on purpose like that. Yes, I know water is not a food, but we feel like it's important enough that we need to keep reminding you to put water in your body overall. Other than that, you'll see on here all the time, there's lean beef, there's berries, there's whole grains, there's eggs. I even have protein shakes on here. Peanut butter, my favorite go-to ever. So there's all sorts of stuff on here that's a whole entire category of food. What I'm telling them is when I'm shopping, when I'm eating, when I'm choosing my foods, pick at least, I would say, the majority of what your plate looks like should come from this list. So if they sit back and think, what did I have for breakfast? Well, I had a bowl of cereal, a banana, and some bacon. I don't know. I would look on here and have them check it out. They have the dairy products on there, so that's good. They have the cereal on there, that's good. They have the banana, that's good. The bacon's not on there, but the majority of my stuff came from this list. I'm good to go. So it helps them hang on the refrigerator, give it to your parents. You can teach them about how to shop for foods too. Supplements. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on here. I do not like supplements for high school athletes. How many of you guys work in high school right now? Most of you? Okay. The reason being, there's a couple things. And it's not the normal ones that you're thinking either. My reasoning is you live with your parents and they're providing your food. Or you're living with someone that's providing your food. You do not have to buy the food yourself. So utilize that opportunity of having that food ready for you and having that food available to you and do that instead. If you drink a protein shake and says that there's 40 grams of protein in it versus having 2 glasses of milk, I know that you're going to get everything, every ounce of protein, every nutrient out of that glass of milk. I have no idea what you're getting or you're getting or you're getting out of that protein shake. Everybody's going to get something different. You might get 5 grams, you might get 8, you might get 25, you might get 40. I have no idea, and there's no way that you know either. So I just try to tell them, try to make sure that you're utilizing foods that you actually have. Use stuff that actually is a little bit more natural, that didn't come from a factory, that we know your body is going to be able to use and handle. That way we know you're getting what we wanted to get. If I'm trying to gain weight at night, I'm not going to tell you to go out and buy creatine. I'm going to tell you to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and drink whole milk and go to bed. And that's going to help you gain weight a lot better and faster than the protein shakes are. Plus, I'm setting you up for better habits. So I'm trying to help them out through that as well. In terms of the supplements up here, creatine works. It absolutely does work. It will help them recover as well. It has a lot of really good benefits. I personally love it. I tell all my athletes to take it. But in high school, I mean, do we really need it at that point? They have a little bit more growing to go. I tell all the freshmen, get off of it when they come in. They're not allowed to take supplements for the first year. Reason being, I want to see how your body responds to the food we're providing you, which is going to be good. It may be you coming from a situation of 1 meal a day to now I'm feeding you 75 times a day. I mean, it just depends, but I want to see how your body reacts to that. I want to see how your body reacts to training. Let's not throw a bunch of stuff at it so that I then have no idea what's working and what isn't. So if I know that the training's working and I know that you're gaining weight from the food, guess what? When you're a junior, we're ready to help you with that little bit of extra edge when your body's saying, and I'm done, and we have to get you through 2 more years. So overall, I'm just telling them, utilize the food as much as possible. Creatine, great. Caffeine we use for some of our runners. Helps them in terms of delaying fatigue. Do I think it works? Absolutely. I think we all know that. I think it's a matter of how often you're using it. We encourage them to take it. Say I'm going to have a competition coming up. I'm not going to tell them to take caffeine every day, all day. I'm going to have them kind of get off of it so their body gets the actual effect when we go into competition. Protein is the one thing I do say high school athletes can use as much as they want to. Just get a good whey protein. There's a lot of research coming out now that says casein, whey, I mean, it's all the same. There's not a big enough difference in terms of the absorption rate, so just go with the whey. Get 100% whey and go with it, and you're good. It's a really good product that way. Electrolytes, of course, Gatorade, I'm always going to push that. I'm always going to push salt for them. I want them to get that stuff in their body. We don't want them cramping, obviously. Unknown is pretty much anything other than that. So those first 4 backed by research, everything other than that is up in the air. Is there stuff that's good? Absolutely. Glutamine is another one, has a lot of good recovery properties, something good that I would recommend to athletes, but as a high school athlete, I'm not trying to throw everything in my bag. I don't want to throw my whole bag of tricks at them on the very first time. I want them to wait and see and adapt and force them to have to recover instead of relying on something else to recover for them. I don't want a magic pill giving them the answers. Drug-free sports are a really good resource. They have a lot of information on there. You can ask a lot of questions. So here's my takeaway. This is my gift to you. Number 1, create some type of something that helps them remember what you want them to learn. Whether it's 3 things: eat a rainbow, eat less legs, drink water. Those are 3 things. You use that as your mantra, and you take that and own it. That becomes your thing. Whether it's fuel, and you come up with something that matches those letters. Whatever it is for you guys, if you find something very basic, it's easier for you to constantly repeat it. It's easier for them to repeat it back to you, but it's also easier for you to help them apply that while they're out there trying to compete. Okay, so that's the very first thing. Come up with something very small. Number 2, you guys do not have time for this. I 100% understand that. It is just you. You may have 0 support. You have 0 time. I know what it's going to be like. So what you need to do is go online and use the heck out of social media. If you go to, like we have one, of course, shameless plug. We have one that we use at Baylor that constantly all I'm doing is like, oh, I'm having watermelon for dinner. Go online, post a couple things about watermelon. You guys, all you have to do is send it out to your kids and you're good. We talk about hydration. We talk about recovery. We talk about everything. Should I tell you what it is? @BU_feed the beast. I think that's what it is. But we're posting infographics all the time. If you're thinking, my kids are wanting to know about vegetables, carrots, why they're good for me. I mean, we've literally posted everything about it. So it just gives you guys a good backup source of information. They tweet, they Snapchat, so do we. So you guys have to catch up with that as well. Use social media like crazy. Every school that has a dietitian will have some type of social media program that you guys can follow. I follow everybody's, and you get lots of good stuff from it. Utilize the resources in terms of your parents and the booster clubs and anyone that can provide you with anything for free. I know this person at the grocery store. Can I get chocolate milk donated from that grocery store to our sports teams? Can I have the moms on the booster club provide the pregame meal before the games for volleyball on Tuesdays and Thursdays? I don't know. Something like that, but set up some type of rotation. Do you have something that you can trade and return back and forth from you guys? I'm not saying that you offer your services in terms of training people, but just can you use anything in any way? Hey, I spoke to your group. Can you guys provide this in return? We need a thing of protein. I don't know. Whatever it is, but just try to trade back and forth. I know this person owns an apple farm. Can he donate some apples to our program and we can have that as our snacks? Can our parents make peanut butter and jelly? Something along those lines. So takeaways wise, use your resources, come up with some type of mantra, and start very, very, very small. In terms of, if I have a kid that hates vegetables, what I'm going to tell him to do is have one bite of one vegetable that day. And if he does that, that is the best thing that has ever happened in life, and we will celebrate that for the next 3 days. And then we're going to have 2 bites. But start with something infinitely small. When we started the program, there was no sports nutrition program. And when we started it, we started with water bottles. Got every single person a water bottle, and then we just talked about hydration until they were sick of hearing about hydration. Talked about everything we possibly could. Here's your water bottle. You have to bring it to workouts. Here's your pee chart in the bathroom. What color is your pee? Tell me other things that help you hydrate, and we just beat it to death. And then we moved on to the next thing. Let's talk about recovery, post-workout. Here's your chocolate milk. How much protein are you getting per day? What am I supposed to be getting it from? What's my best sources? So start infinitely small so it's no skin off of your back to start. And then move on from there. Okay. Questions about anything either that I covered or did not cover overall? Or I was so good you didn't have any questions at all. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I forgot. Okay. So it says in weight-dependent sports, especially with female athletes, what would I suggest for calorie intake? Depends on the sport. If we're talking like, that's hard to say. So this is the other part. I was a gymnast. I clearly don't look like a gymnast. I'm very tall for a gymnast, and I'm very large for a gymnast. So if I had to guesstimate, I would say for any type of female athlete, anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 is a pretty good start, but I wouldn't know or be able to tell you anything beyond that unless I saw them and was aware of what was happening in their body. Does that help? I would say a good start would be 2,000 to 3,000 calories. Form of nutrition assessment. What form of nutrition assessment do I feel has the greatest advantage in adherence for high school athletes? Probably overall just hydration. Are you talking specifically about like you talking body composition, or who asked the question? Anyone? What are you talking about exactly?
Correct and up-to-date information that a high school athlete can provide, and you can provide the quickest feedback for that?
24 hours. So what I never do have anyone do anything, it depends on the person, but usually at 24 hours, I'll have them sit down and just say, tell me 24 hours. Reason being, they usually can't remember what they had for breakfast that day. But also because that gives me a pretty good picture. Then I ask them, is this typical, not typical? And then we just slide through and walk through and spread it out like that meal timing sheet that was up there. We'll do it that way. And that I feel like has the best effect. Why do you have your athletes consuming whey protein at night and not casein? Thought casein was better. Reason is, casein they used to say was really a lot better. Now they're saying there's not much difference, but it's also because I don't want them buying 2 sets of proteins. So if they get a combo protein, great, that has whey and casein in it. But for the most part, a lot of the people that I'm working with can't afford to do both of them. So what I'll tell them is do the whey and just use that. And that way you're still getting the recovery from it. It is faster absorbing, but it's not enough of a difference for me to care. And if you're really concerned about it, drink some milk. And that will help you with the casein content part of it. So we just kind of have them mix it up that way. It just makes it easier for them to not have to spend so much money. What are some recommendations for getting high school athletes and parents on board with providing more nutritious foods and meals? What I've really found that works is if you find someone that they admire, or if you find a group or a team, or you find professional sports, or you find a college team and say, I talked to this person on this college team, this is what they're doing with their kids, we should start to maybe fix some of the stuff that we're doing with our kids. That tends to work a little bit better. Versus you personally going up to them and saying, we should change our meals because this isn't healthy enough, or this isn't working for our guys. They would rather see like, oh, well, colleges are doing this, and in their mind, college is what I want my kid to be going to, or that's where the kids want to go to. They're more likely to listen to what they're doing at a college versus you, because you're not cool once you work there. Like me, I'm not cool anymore. What's my approach for discussing nutrition with female athletes? My approach always with all athletes, not just females, is always performance-based. I'm not going to talk to them about their weight unless it's in a performance sense. Again, it's very easy for me to relate to them. I got the fat talks. I had the coach that sat me down and said, get smaller. If you're big, you're big. Guess what? But performance-wise, if you can perform, then let's do that. If your coach comes up to me and says, I need this person to lose 10 pounds, why? Because you don't like the look of them or because they're not performing? If the answer is performance, we can do that. Because usually the kid knows that too. So what I'll usually start the conversation with a female athlete is, how do you feel like practice has been going lately? How have you been competing lately? How are you feeling energy-wise? Do you feel like you're competing at your best? What do you feel like could change from that? Was there some differences that you've noticed from a time you were competing really well to now? And I'll let them either guide them to that and let them figure it out, or they usually already know. And it just kind of depends from there. We'll kind of take it in whatever direction they want to move it to. But if they say, I feel great, and I'm competing better, and I'm PRing left and right, I'm not going to make them lose weight. Then I'm going to come back to the coach and say, tell me why you want her to lose weight. If she's doing this great here and she's qualifying for all these things, then you tell me why now. Hopefully that helps you. Best opportunities for a coach, trainer, RD to provide nutrition education to a team or individual athlete. The way that we do it at Baylor, and I also did this at Missouri, was during the lift. I'm at every lift. Helps that I'm a strength coach. But when I'm at every lift, when we do a breakdown at the end of the lift, then that's when I give my message as well. So our head strength coach will talk. He always passes it to me, and then I'll do literally 2 minutes maximum of some type of message. And then they have that little bit of blurb in their head, and then we go on the rest of the day. So I personally think that's the best time because they're the most focused at that point, and they can feel it at that point. If you're all laying on the ground cramping, guess what we're going to be talking about today? Same thing about it, it says, how do you talk to female athletes about body weight? It's the same way. Depending on the reason I'm talking to them about it, but it's always gonna be performance-based. So I have a lot of kids that come in, their coaches want them to lose. Of course, I'm always going to, first of all, be completely transparent with them and just say, do you know why you're here to see me? And if they say no, that's our first problem. But how do you feel performance-wise? How do you feel like things have been going? And then I'll lead up to it. If they have no idea, I'll lead up to it and just say, well, I was talking to your coach and we were talking about your body weight. The changes have been this. How do you feel about it? What do you think about it? And then at that point, we kind of carry the conversation from there. I try to let the coaches not do that themselves because they tend to have a non-tactful way of saying it that makes the problem worse a lot of times. So what I'll do is talk to the coach first. We'll either decide he or I or she or I will do it together or separately, or I'll just take care of it. Let me be the bad guy when it comes to food and nutrition. Don't let them worry about that coming from you as a coach. Let me be that person that helps, that does that part. What's more important for athletes, getting enough sleep or eating a good breakfast before a workout? Great question. I would say breakfast. Because no matter what, I'm going to be going over some type of chunk of time where I'm not going to be getting any fuel in my body. So regardless, if I slept for 2 hours, I still was probably, hopefully, laying around playing video games, listening to music, watching TV. I'm still burning those calories. I'm still going to need fuel for the workout that I'm going to be doing. That's going to provide me with a little bit of energy. But if they're going to tell me, this is another thing that I tell them too, you're not waking up and magically transporting yourself right to a workout. You have to drive. You have to get out of your bed. You have to walk. You have to ride a bus. You have to do something that requires you to transport yourself in some way, shape, or form. You have time to dump some cereal in a bag and carry it out the door with you. I'm not saying make an elaborate breakfast. I'm talking literally grab the box of cereal and take it with you in the car, put it between your legs and reach your hand in it and eat it. Like, it's not anything that's going to be complicated. I'm talking as easy as possible. If it's a Pop-Tart, it's a Pop-Tart. Eat something. But it doesn't have to be eggs and bacon and toast. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for very basic somethings to be put either in your car or right by the door so you can grab it and go. Simple recommendations for a vegan or vegetarian high school athlete who also plays on travel teams. Those are complicated. Simple recommendations would be, oh geez. My simple recommendation would be send them to an RD. Make sure they're taking a multivitamin, and then make sure, energy-wise, that they're getting enough calories. So find out how many times a day that they're eating, find out how often they're eating, find out, I would say if they're not eating as a high school and travel squad athlete, if they're not eating at least 5 times a day, it's probably not enough. And those 5 times would be, to me, in my mind, breakfast, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, dinner, and then bedtime snack. But I would just, multivitamin is going to be super important at that point for them. Hopefully their parents are very educated. Advice for students that are vegetarian, again, same thing. My thoughts on ZMA, it's wonderful. ZMA is great. It's a recovery supplement, can be used as a recovery supplement. Take it before bed, gives very vivid dreams, but it does help. It's a good supplement. Yes, you can get my presentation, my PowerPoint. My email is Jana_Heitmeyer. I think I can go to the first slide in a second, maybe. So JANA_HEITMEYER @Baylor.edu. Yes, you can email me, and yes, I'll get back to you. If you have complicated questions, I will answer them, I promise. Anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I am done. Good.